Chairman, it's 10 o'clock.
Leanne, thank you. Good morning, everybody. And for those watching online, I'm Councillor Jim McKenna, Independent Cornwall Councillor for Penzance Promenade, and I chair this committee. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the virtual meeting of the Economic Growth and Development of the Scrutiny Committee today. And before consideration of today's business, I will outline the protocols for the meeting. Today's meeting is being live streamed to the public via Microsoft Teams and is also being recorded. May I remind members and officers to introduce yourselves each time you speak if I don't, and turn your video and microphone off when you finish speaking. And the reason for that is because that tends to increase the strength of reception for those in more rural areas. And as I speak, I can see Councillor Olivier on my screen. Welcome, Councillor Olivier.
Just checking my hair was all right. Okay.
If the council's live stream fails during the meeting and we cannot share the proceedings, I will adjourn the meeting so that access can be restored. If the issue cannot be resolved, I will halt the meeting and the remaining business will be concluded at a future date. Members wishing to speak or ask a question should indicate by typing X in the chat box. And as I call members to speak, I will remind you to switch on your microphone. If for some reason you can't be heard, a Democratic and Governance Officer will advise you. Just to remind members, so you'll be given up to 2 minutes to speak and reminded when 30 seconds are remaining. I'm making 2 exceptions today, and that's in relation to 2 of the reports on the agenda, and those who chaired the particular panels will be given up to 5 minutes to introduce. When we vote today, that'll be done by roll call procedure. The Democratic and Governance Officer will read out the recommendation and the name of the proposer and seconder, and will then call each committee member's name in turn. You should confirm your name and advise whether you vote in favour or against the recommendation, or whether you wish to abstain. The Democratic and Governance Officer will then count the votes and advise the result accordingly. Where a member has declared a non-registrable interest, a disclosable pecuniary interest, or an interest by virtue of any trade union membership in a matter, they must leave the virtual meeting. Their departure will be confirmed and they will be invited to rejoin the meeting at the appropriate time. I do plan to have a 10-minute break at about 11:40, but I've learned from experience that might not be possible, but I will try and have a break, and I will try and avoid breaking mid-agenda item. And finally from me for the moment, before we start today's business, I'll ask Lynn Davey, the Democratic and Governance Officer, to confirm members' attendance. Thank you. Lynn.
Thank you, Chairman. I will now call each councillor by name, and I would ask that each councillor confirm their name and their electoral division. So I'll start with Councillor Biscoe, please.
Berwick, Boscawen and Division. I should just notify you that I will have to leave at 11:15 and return at about 1 p.m.
Thank you, Councillor Biscoe. Councillor Brown.
Good morning. Malcolm Brown, St Austell, Bethel.
Thank you. Councillor Cole.
Good morning, St Enoder Division, Dick Cole.
Thank you. Councillor Duffin.
Good morning, Joyce Duffin, Cornwall Councillor for Mount Hawke and Portreath.
Thank you. Councillor Ellenbrook.
Good morning, Barbara Ellenbrook, Cornwall Councillor for Redruth Central.
Thank you. Councillor Frost.
Councillor Frost for Bodmin St Petrock.
Thank you. Councillor LeBroy.
Good morning, Peter LeBroy, Councillor for Bude.
Thank you. We have apologies from Councillor McLenning, and he's been substituted by Councillor Towell. Councillor Towell, please.
Good morning, Kevin Towell, Newquay Ferris.
Thank you. Councillor Thomas, please.
Councillor Mike Thomas, representing the land of North Helston.
Councillor Olivier.
Good morning, Cornelius Olivier, representing Penzance Central.
Thank you. Councillor Pascoe.
Good morning, Councillor Pascoe, representing Liskeard West and Ogwalls.
Thank you. Councillor Pollard.
Good morning, everybody. John Pollard, Hale North.
Thank you. Councillor Robinson.
Richard Robinson, St Ives East.
Thank you. Councillor Rushworth.
Stephen Rushworth, St Izzy and St Judy.
Thank you. And Councillor Thomas, please. Councillor Thomas?
Which one?
Councillor Mike Thomas.
I did give my. I am here. Councillor Mike Thomas from the land of North Helston.
Thank you. Have I missed somebody out?
You've missed me, Lynn, but that's fine because I introduced myself at the start. But Councillor Jim McKenna, Independent, Cornwall Councillor, Penzance Promenade.
I do apologise for that. My list is inaccurate, so apologies. Thank you.
Okay.
Also in attendance, we have Cabinet members with us, which is Councillor Jeff Brown, Cabinet Member for Transport, Councillor Dwelly, Cabinet Member for Culture, Economy and Planning, Councillor Mitchell, Cabinet Member for Homes, and Councillor Hannaford, Cabinet Member for Climate Change and Neighbourhoods. Also in attendance, we have officers supporting the debate and with any technical questions. This is Mr. Phil Mason, Director for Economic Growth and Development, Emily Kent, Head of Economy, Skills and Culture, David Rodder, Economic Growth Manager, Joe Roberts, Private Rented Sector Housing Manager, John Lloyd Owen, Service Director for Housing, Louise Wood, Service Director for Planning and Sustainable Development, Richard Grant, Head of Planning Policy, Tracy Stepney, Strategic Finance Manager, myself, Lynn Davey, Democratic and Governance Officer, Leanne Martin, who will be producing the meeting, and Ian Buckingham, who is dealing with the live stream today. Thank you, Chairman.
Lynn, thank you. That takes us on to the agenda proper. We've noted, but just for the minutes, Councillor McFanning is absent today. He's being subbed by Councillor Kevin Towell. Kevin, you're very welcome. Councillor Robinson will miss part of the meeting, hopefully an hour or so only, and Councillor Biscoe, as he's let us know, will be absent from approximately 10:45 till approximately 1 p.m. Other than that, we have a full group, so welcome everybody once again. Does anybody have any interests in matters on the agenda today they wish to declare? In which case, thank you. Item 3 then, the minutes of the meeting held on the 12th of January 2021. Can I take them in page order for accuracy first, please? So page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, and page 9. Members, thank you. So any matters arising not on the agenda today? Page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, and page 9. Members, thank you again. Can I have a proposer and seconder for the minutes, please, and then we'll take the vote. So, proposer, please. I will propose.
Brett will second.
Thank you. So, proposed by myself, seconded by Councillor Biscoe. Lynn, do you want to just do the roll call, please?
Yes, so just to confirm that the recommendation is that the minutes of the meeting of the Economic Growth and Development Overview and Scrutiny Committee held on the 12th of January 2021 were correctly recorded and that they be signed by the Chairman. This is proposed by Councillor McKenna and seconded by Councillor Biscoe. And going to the roll call, Councillor Biscoe.
4.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
4.
Thank you. Councillor Cole.
4.
Councillor Duffin.
4.
Councillor Ellenbrook.
4.
Councillor Frost.
4.
Councillor LeBroy.
4.
Thank you. Councillor McKenna.
4.
Councillor Towell. Probably an abstention, I should think.
I'll abstain.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Olivier.
4.
Go.
I must abstain. I wasn't present. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Pollard.
4.
Councillor Robinson.
4.
Councillor Rushworth.
4.
Councillor Thomas.
4.
Thank you, Chairman. That's been carried. 13 votes, none against, and 2 abstentions.
Lynn, thank you very much. Members, thank you. We don't have, item 4, we don't have any public questions on this occasion, which brings me to my opening remarks. And sadly for members, this is a rather longer session than usual because I've been tasked with giving a very quick overview of the work of the committee over the last 4 years. So this is the last meeting of this committee, the Economic Growth and Development Overview and Scrutiny Committee within this current administration. Reflecting on the work of the committee over the last 4 years, it can be proud of its involvement in the scrutiny and development of a number of key policies. These include the Housing Development and Housing Revenue Account Development Programme for Cornwall, the establishment of the Cornwall Investment Programme, and participation in the continued and very necessary, in my view, overview of the business plans for the group of companies, including Treveth Holdings, the development and implementation of the One Public Transport System and Positive Parking Framework work for Cornwall, and as Councillor Biscoe reminds me, preparatory work on the local transport plan is also now underway. And apologies for impinging on your area, Councillor Jeff Brown. The committee has also overseen the development of a long-term spatial strategy for Cornwall, the current Cornwall local plan, and the emerging climate emergency development plan document. Committee has also been involved in the development of the COVID-19 Economic Recovery and Renewal Plan, the development of the local industrial strategy, informing the Creative Manifesto as Cornwall's strategy for its rural creative economy, and more latterly the Cornwall and West Devon Mining Landscape World Heritage Site Management Plan. And in the last few weeks, committee and its cabinet members have had a watching brief of the Shared Prosperity Fund, and no doubt 1 or 2 cabinet members will want to comment when we get to cabinet members' questions toward the end of the meeting. Many of committee members have been involved in a number of inquiries which have been valuable in shaping council policy and resources. These include the Positive Parking Review, I remember it well, delivering homes, jobs and communities, Cornwall's capacity to deliver homes, vitality of high streets, private rented sector housing, and the economic vitality of rural and coastal homes. And we'll hear more about those 2 shortly. I would particularly like to thank all the members involved in delivering these inquiries, and the chairman who listened and collated the evidence from many expert witnesses who I also thank. These include Councillors Robinson, Dwelly, Labroy and Olivier. I would also like to thank the cabinet members for their attendance, for providing written cabinet updates. Councillor Mitchell, you'd be delighted to know we just got yours, and answering the committee's many questions. Thanks therefore go to Councillors Mitchell, Brown, Dwelly and Hannaford, plus Councillor Bob Edgerton, who served the committee for the first 3 years of its run. Can I extend committee's thanks to the previous chairman of Economic Growth and Development Committee, the estimable Councillor Bert Biscoe, and also to our vice chairman, Councillor Joyce Duffin, who has been a great support to me and Councillor Biscoe. And I mean that genuinely, Joyce. You've been fabulous. You've reminded me of things. You've reminded me that meetings are happening, and you've encouraged me to be on time, amongst many other things. So thank you. And thank you also to Bert for the first 2.5 years. I would also like to extend my thanks to all officers who provided the committee with detailed reports and given presentations both at this committee and at our monthly development sessions. In particular, Phil Mason and his service directors, Louise Wood, John Lloyd Owen and Glenn Kaplan Gray, and all their staff for their excellent insight and guidance throughout this period. Reflecting on my 18 months or so as chairman, this year has obviously been an unprecedented time due to the pandemic, which has resulted in a very different way of working, which we all had to learn to adapt, and in my case I'm still learning to adapt to, and evolve to ensure that the needs of our communities were put first. I would therefore like to thank Democratic Services for all their support in supporting members and officers in making the transition to virtual meetings, if not painless, then largely successful. And particular thanks to Lynn, who is with us today, to Amy Sweet and Elliot Riddington, who were the previous officers responsible for managing these meetings. The good news is I'm nearly finished. So finally, I'd like to wish all members of all parties, of all colours, standing the up and coming elections, the very best of luck, and to thank those members who are not standing for their service to Cornwall Council. You will all be missed. Looking forward to the new administration, a member, in inverted commas, has put forward a marker to the administration, this is post-May, asking that they consider the following: the structural links between farming, food processing, the importance of the managed landscape to both our resident population, our holiday brand, and the locational resonance for the knowledge economy, he believes the next council should urgently consider and debate how the changes to farming, farms, landscape and culture will be affected by the changes in agricultural policy regime brought about by leaving the EU. Now, Lynn, you should have a note of that, but I'd like that to be recorded as part of the minutes, please, so that whoever chairs this committee after the election is aware of it. And that concludes my overview, my update. Thank you very much for your patience in listening. Hope those of you that didn't have got a nice cup of coffee, and we can crack on with the rest of the meeting. That takes us then to agenda item 6, which is on page 10 of the agenda, and Councillor Olivier will introduce, and he'll be supported by John Lloyd Owen. Councillor Olivier, you good to go?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I'll just put my camera on as I'm speaking. Sorry, I just need to arrange that.
That's okay. For anybody wishing, the title of this report is the PRS Inquiry, Additional Informal Session to Review the Regulation of Social Housing Standards in Cornwall.
I will be brief, Chair, briefer than 5 minutes, hopefully, because this was a one-session occasion. I think the evidence presented to the inquiry demonstrated very clearly that the situation in the social rented sector in Cornwall is in some ways considerably better than in the private rented sector. You know, this committee heard in great detail what the problems are in the private rented sector. Some of the problems that occur in the private rented sector are much less prevalent, and we've got statistical evidence for that. For instance, the number of households that didn't meet the decent homes standard in the social rented sector nationally is 12%. I'm surprised it's that high, actually. But the number of households in the private rented sector in Cornwall that didn't meet the decent homes standard was 50%. Also, the evidence received was that a much lower level of fuel poverty existed in the social rented sector than in the private rented sector. And also, the social rented sector is more regulated, and social rented tenants have clearer sort of chains or lines of responsibility to deal with when they have problems. This is all true, clearly true. But that doesn't mean that we didn't identify problems and that those problems don't need addressing. So I think it's fair to say these problems appear to be more prevalent in the larger social landlords, the sanctuaries and the Live Wests, than in the smaller, more locally based ones. So if you look at our recommendations, they acknowledge that those problems exist, and we're doing our best to address them through our recommendations. And I hope those recommendations can in some way be accommodated in the work programme of this committee in the future. I'm not quite sure where we stand on that, as this is the last meeting of the committee. I mean, I and other members of the committee, I think, received a letter prepared by the Community Network panel of the Red Ruth area last night, pointing up some of the problems that exist in the social rented sector. I recognise this, and I think the recommendations meet those concerns that were raised, particularly if they can be incorporated in the work programme. And again, I think it's down to larger social landlords being problematic, and I do think Cornwall Council as a housing authority needs to have more of a handle on what those organisations are doing. To give one own parochial example, people in Penzance were very, very disappointed that Live West chose to unload their former office building in Penzance to the highest bidder, rather than accepting a market bid from Cornwall Council to use for housing purposes. That's struck me as, you know, kind of going against the culture of social providers, and perhaps it is a piece of local evidence as to why they need challenging. On the other hand, a very large part of my casework is to do with the problems that private sector tenants, young families in work with small children have, even identifying who their landlord is through the barrier put up by that landlord's agent. So I would stick very much to the argument that the situation in the social rented sector is better than in the private rented sector, but that does not mean we do not need a better situation to be created, and that Cornwall Council should be a part of that. But otherwise, I'm quite happy to commend the recommendations as being adequate to that task. Right, thank you, Chair. That'll do me. I think it was less than 5 minutes.
It was just, Councillor Levy, thank you. For members' benefit, the recommendations are on pages 10 and 11. Before I invite members to question or comment or propose and second recommendations, Mr. Lloyd Owen, is there anything you wish to add to anything Councillor Levy said?
Thank you, Chair. Well, as Councillor Levy said, the informal inquiry session found that while overall social housing properties are of a reasonable standard, and overall of a better standard than in the private rented sector or parts of the private rented sector, it's clear that there are issues across the sector and some variability between social landlords in terms of both property conditions and the services provided. We welcome the recommendations as a housing service, and I agree it would be helpful to monitor standards across the social housing sector in Cornwall to encourage you all to come up to the best standard. The inquiry session was advised of the government's plan in the white paper, which was published last year, to introduce national performance standards for the first time for all social housing providers and to help tenants to hold their landlords to account and to improve the arrangements for tenants to obtain redress where there are issues. I think the recommendations will integrate well with these expected changes to regulation and performance oversight in the social housing sector. Finally, the inquiry session also identified there was a need to extend engagement between social landlords and local members and councils on their investment plans and services, and we'd be very happy to take this forward with social housing partners. Thank you, Chair.
John, thank you very much. Okay, members, questions, comments. Councillor Ellenbrook, you're first up.
Thank you very much. And can I just state here and now that I have no problem with what we decided in the private rented sector. I believe that what we discussed and what this committee approved was absolutely correct. So my comments are nothing to do with that at all. My concern is that we had a one-day session. We only heard from one housing provider, and we didn't hear from any tenants. And as some of you will know, there have been some issues that have been highlighted, certainly in my community network area, that's Camborne Pool, Lugden, Redruth and the mining villages, about some problems with a particular social landlord in our patch. And my concern is that I am worried that if we know about these 3 or 4 cases, because residents have actually brought them to the attention of the relevant local members, how many more cases are there that we don't know about? And it isn't just in our area. I have seen evidence from similar problems with a selection of social rented providers from all over Cornwall. So if I had known when we did this inquiry what I know now, I might have spoken more strongly in support of us actually in the future maybe having a similar inquiry into the social rented housing, because frankly the stories that I have heard are really, really disturbing. And of particular concern to me is the fact that the reason for a lot of the repairs not being done or the issues not being dealt with was COVID. And in the private sector, the people who are doing building repairs, maintenance and all the rest of it have still been working in a COVID safe way throughout the pandemic. So I fail to understand why the particular issues that we have highlighted in our patch were not and have not been addressed. And I appreciate also that perhaps as a council we don't have the same control, for want of a better word, over the social housing system, but I think we need to investigate this further. Anybody living in a substandard accommodation, whoever their landlord is a blot on our record and should not be allowed. Thank you.
Councillor Ellenbrook, thank you. Councillor Biscoe.
Chairman, thank you. I just wanted to speak for a moment. Well, firstly, to thank all the officers who were engaged in this inquiry, and indeed in the earlier part of the inquiry as well. And I think this is a really helpful set of recommendations. I just wanted to focus for a moment on 3. Which is the one to lobby government to make changes to overview and scrutiny. I'm a member also of the adults. I forgot what it's called, the health scrutiny committee or whatever it's called. And that, of course, is participated in by the various hospital trusts in working in health, which makes it a very useful and helpful cross-institutional scrutiny arena. And that's all to the good. And it seems to me that the synergies between health and housing and care are so close that actually being able to exercise a similar degree of scrutiny over other other publicly funded housing providers, housing associations in other words, would be a really strong, really positive thing to do, and would actually mean that the relationship between other parts of the sector and the council is as close as it can be. And I think that we would be exercising, the democratic mandate that we have in a proper way by lobbying for this. My question is this: is that if we wish to progress this, is there not a case for it being referred, I think, to the Constitution and Governance Committee, who would clearly have to consider, an extension of the remit of whichever scrutiny committee would take that on, prior to us actually getting back to lobbying government. There's no point in going and lobbying government if we don't understand how it is that we would make accommodation if government actually decided to agree. And I do think it's quite an attractive proposition for the government to extend the mandate in this way. We must remember that the government, through whatever the housing corporation is now called, does fund these organisations in the same way that it funds the health service. And I think it's got a much less effective grip over the public accountability, particularly the local accountability of housing associations, than perhaps people would like to see these days.
Okay, Councillor Biscoe, thank you. John, would you like to come in on comment on Councillor Zellenbrook and Biscoe's comments, please?
Just wanted to pick up on Bert's comments, if I may.
Okay, sorry, I was meaning John Lloyd Owen, but Councillor Pollard,
sorry.
You've started, so you can finish, Councillor Pollard.
Sorry, I'm working above my station. I do apologise. It was Bert's comments about bringing scrutiny of this area into Cornwall Council, and I think I take his point about going to C&G, but I do think it is a direct government lobby in the sense that the health scrutiny have a statutory responsibility to scrutinise health, and therefore the health providers have an obligation to turn up. And we need the same obligation from the housing associations if that's going to work. So I commend the idea, and I think it is a direct lobby from the next administration straight to government.
Councillor Pollard, thank you. Mr. Lloyd Owen.
Thank you again, Chair. In respect to Councillor Ellenbrook's concerns, I entirely recognise and understand them. Of course, there are issues in the social housing sector, both in terms of property condition and indeed housing services provided to tenants, and those are of concern. And she made mention of some recent cases of concern that we brought to my attention and by members in her area. We do work very closely with our housing association partners across a range of forums, looking to encourage the highest possible standards and to address issues where those arise. We could certainly look to formalise those arrangements and to bring out further information on both performance, complaints and other areas of interest, but it clearly is a matter for the remit of the scrutiny committee, or indeed, as members have said, for government, about any wider reform in terms of accountability to local authorities on social housing landlords' performance in our area. In respect to the repairs position during the course of the last year in the context of COVID, government guidance, certainly for a significant period of the last year, has been to undertake essential repairs to address health and safety issues, and to not undertake non-essential repairs or non-emergency repairs rather, to keep tenants safe, many of whom or a number of whom would have been shielding, and also to safeguard staff and contractors. Thank you.
Mr. Lloyd-Owen, thank you. I saw Councillor Mitchell, notwithstanding an X in the box is the custom. I saw your hand go up. So do you wish to comment as Cabinet Member?
Yes, thank you, Chairman, and sorry for not following the rules correctly. So I totally agree with what Mr. Lloyd-Owen's just said. We obviously are concerned about the standard of all housing in Cornwall, and you know, to be perfectly blunt, all of it could do with improving, but there are some good practices. The direct intervention of the council, to be honest, we lost that 40 years ago when most of the council's housing stock was privatised and sold off. And what this government has done, which I most welcome, has to been passed legislation where it really improves tenant forums, and you know that they would argue that those are the best routes for tenants to say to their landlord, you aren't doing a job which we think is good enough, and that has been really beefed up in local legislation, and I really welcome that. But we can do better. We do need to look at it, but I'm not sure if the government or housing association partners would necessarily welcome us sticking our nose in at every opportunity. I think trying to build up relationships. We do have good working relationships with all our partners in Cornwall, and I think we should also try that route as to make a huge improvement to residents' lives, and that's what we're all here for in the housing department, in the associations, is to make sure that everybody has a decent home to live in. And one of the other questions I think we can sit here and also with our own HRA account as well as the partners. It's great to build new houses, and those are certainly our own ones as we move forward will be to an absolutely fantastic standard. But I think it's a fair question to ask, how are we all, council included through CHL, how are we all maintaining the existing stock and bringing that up to a decent standard as well?
Councillor Mitchell, thank you. CHL, for those watching, is Cornwall Housing Limited. Councillor Levy, I'll bring you in at the end, but I've got Councillor Mike Thomas who wishes to sort of comment or ask a question around the report.
Thank you, Chair. That's fine.
Thank you, Chair. I'll declare an interest as a private sector landlord, but I don't like the wording in recommendation 1. I know that there are issues regarding private sector landlords and the state of properties. It's my opinion that there is perhaps a greater differential between private sector property in terms of good and bad than perhaps there is in the more corporate model of social housing. But private sector landlords provide a service which is required and respected, and there are many private sector landlords throughout Cornwall who belong to the Cornwall Council-led responsible landlord scheme, and I think we should give them that credit. There should be the scope for greater intervention at no cost to the tenants, so that certain landlords can be penalised and brought to account for poor performance. But I think the wording where it says overall standards and that social housing exceeds, I would like to see the data for that, because no one has, to the best of my knowledge, gone around every single private rental property and compared every private rental property with those of the social housing providers. So I would much prefer to see wording that is a little bit softer and embraces the terminology that Councillor Mitchell expressed, that everything could be better, all housing could improve across all areas. That's the point, with a sort of question within the middle of it, I think. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Thomas, thank you. I'll bring in Councillor Rushworth, and then Mr. Lloyd Owen, I'll invite you to come back on what you've just heard. So, Stephen Rushworth.
Thank you. I'd like to concur with Councillor Thomas. I'm not happy with the wording in recommendation number 1. I appreciate there are rogue landlords all over in certain parts of the county, but I don't think it's holistic. Here where I operate in Weybridge, and I had a discussion with Carol Mould, and she shared my views. It's the social rented and the council housing, and that where the poorest conditions are in Weybridge. I think there's very few houses in my area, and probably most of North Cornwall, where the private sector is abusing the things. There's the odd one or two, they always are in life, but the rented stock in our area is private rented stock is far superior to the council stock, probably because it's not as old. I think the difficulty forms in when large buildings in towns are converted, and by the nature of the design that has to conform, they become very quirky, trying to deal with the fire issues and everything. And it's very difficult for a single landlord who's, say, got a lease in one of these converted ones that wants to rent them to be able to do much, because he can't solve a lot of the problems without getting everybody who's got a house there to join in the improvements that are required, and a lot of them are I've got space issues, so I don't think it's anywhere near 50%. Personally, I've shared Mike Thomas's, and I've got a worry here that we're sending out a message to private landlords which criticizing ones who shouldn't be criticized, and there's a very margin at the moment, especially around the coastal areas, where landlords are now considering whether it's better to go into the the Airbnb market and not provide the service that they've been providing, and I think that's going to cause us real difficulties in the future. So I'm not happy with recommendation 1, and I couldn't support this because of that, but if there is some softening of that wording, then I could possibly support. Thank you.
Councillor Rushworth, thank you. Maybe Councillor Thomas and yourself might want to think about proposing an amendment to that when we come to the vote in a few minutes. Mr. Lloyd Owen, do you wish to come in on what you just heard, and I'll bring in other councillors who've indicated?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I entirely agree with Councillor Thomas. I think what the evidence does show is that the variability in standards is greater in the private rented sector. So again, as Councillor Rushworth remarked, there are many good, indeed very high quality properties in the private rented sector, but there is a minority of the sector which is non-decent, with very poor energy efficiency, that provides poor standards, and indeed where there are on occasion not very good management services provided either. And I think the reflection from the inquiry session was that within the social housing sector, you don't get quite the same variability, that overall standards are reasonable, but we should in no way be complacent, and there are issues within the social housing sector too that need to be addressed. So it's perhaps not for me to suggest amendments, but I think the point wasn't to say that the private rented sector is problematic in its totality, but that there are certainly issues of concern within the private rented sector, and there's a need to ensure that the social housing sector is brought up to a common high standard.
Okay, John, thank you. It's obviously for members to consider whether they wish to propose an amendment, which we'll find out in a minute or two. So, Councillor Towell.
Yeah, just as a substitute on this committee and looking at this with fresh eyes, so to speak, I had the impression reading through this that, particularly in part 1, it is drawing a distinction between different types of landlords, which I don't think is very helpful. I think, you know, we should be in partnership with this sector to try and raise the quality of all our housing here in Cornwall. And I think this is the wording is, as already has been pointed out, is a little unnecessarily divisive, I think, and I think we should be emphasising the partnership a lot more in the wording.
Councillor Towell, thank you very much. Councillor Duffin.
Thank you, Chair. I think we need to remember what this, the reason for this inquiry session was. We're here to look at the housing in Cornwall and the condition of it. There are distinctions because there are differences. We're here to help people who have no choice where they live. They generally have restricted incomes, and with the housing crisis that we have in Cornwall, landlords can charge a lot of money for very poor conditioned houses. I'm really concerned that as a committee, we're starting now to look at, oh dear, poor landlords, some of them are really good, we shouldn't be tarring them with the same brush. We're not tarring them with the same brush. The good ones are great, but we're here to protect people that can only afford houses that are poor quality. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, yes, there are some landlords that are really good, but there's some that aren't. And I'm just, you know, we're turning around going, oh, but, you know, we're making landlords a victim, the ones that are good. No, we're not. The reason for this report is to protect people that can't afford good quality housing, and they shouldn't be living in the situation that they are. And, you know, I'm horrified that we're looking here going, oh, let's look after the poor landlords. Some landlords are brilliant. We're not tarring them all with the same brush, but we're here to protect people that don't have good landlords. So I'll be supporting it as it's laid out in the report.
Councillor Duffin, thank you. It is obviously within members' gift to propose an amendment, and if that's supported, then there we go. I've got Councillor Long. You're not a committee member, so you may not be familiar. You may not have heard earlier that we indicate a wish to speak with an X in the box, because I can't keep tabs on 30 odd people via these sort of little round buttons that there are. So I'll bring you in at this point if you want to ask a question or comment briefly. But if you do want to,
thank you very much. And my apologies, I wasn't aware of the little white box, putting the X in a box. But well, fortunately, Councillor Duffin has said exactly what I was going to say. I would have thought, looking at the report, this is a report to deal with those where we do have problem landlords, where we do have rogue landlords, and the people who are using it are the residents who are at risk, are the ones who don't have a choice of where they live. And therefore, you know, in my division, the issue we have with poor properties is not in the socially rented sector, it's in the private rented sector. So I think I totally agree with Councillor Duffin's comments on that.
Councillor Long, thank you. Councillor Ellenbrook, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, if I can. I'm sorry, there seem to be a few hairs set running on this, but my reading of the title of this item is Additional Informal Session to Review the Regulation of Social Housing Standards in Cornwall, and that's what I've been endeavouring to say, is that, and I said it and I will say it again, what we decided as a committee on the private rented housing has been done, has been dusted, and it's there. This issue is about standards of social housing in Cornwall, where there are some instances where they are not as good as they could be. And I do think, and I agree totally with what Councillor Biscoe said, but I would also ask that maybe a good way of potentially dealing with any issues that we as local members may have is for the housing associations to let us know as members who their contact is if we have a resident who comes to us with an issue or a concern, because that, to be honest with you, is one of the most difficult things to do, is to actually know who within what is often a very large organisation one needs to speak to as a local member to stand up for a resident who is having some problems. that was all that I was talking about, and I think we've gone a bit off piste on this. We need to be concentrating on social housing, not on the private rented sector. That's over and done with. Thank you.
Councillor Ellenbrook, thank you. And coincidentally, I had exactly that conversation with Live West last week in terms of who do I speak to, because I've got a number of residents who would like to have some local representation. Okay, that concludes the member contribution at this stage. Mr. Lloyd-Owen, do you wish to comment on what you've heard from the last group of members before we come to?
Could I come back, Chair?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Councillor Olivia, my mistake. Yeah, you.
Yeah, look, I'll be very brief, Chair. Look, I'd like to thank Councillor Ellenbrook for reminding us all that we're here to discuss the council's attitude and position towards social rented housing. As she says, there's no point. We're not here to revisit debates we've already had about the private rented sector. We're talking about social landlords. I actually think it's if we look at the wording of the recommendation, recognises that overall the standard and condition of social housing in Cornwall exceeds that of private rented sector housing, but that more could be done, particularly in certain areas, to improve the social housing. I find it very difficult to interpret that as some kind of vicious attack on private landlords. A broad statement that overall the standards are higher in the social rented sector is not an attack on private landlords. And as I tried to point out, in my introduction, the stats are there. In terms of the decent home standard in Cornwall, 50% of private rented sector houses don't meet it. Fuel poverty, which exists in the social rented sector, which it shouldn't do, is more prevalent in the private rented sector. There is an enormous variation. I would say the final part I'd make, Chair, is that I perhaps didn't emphasise enough in my anxiety to get under 5 minutes, was that recommendation 2, little 2, better collaboration by social housing provided with the council, local members, town and parish council on local investment plans. Because I think one thing which you've kind of alluded to that we don't have is a sense of any kind of local control over the investment plans of large housing providers like Sanctuary and Live West. I don't get the impression their local management has got much autonomy in this, and we don't really have an arm on it. So that's something, we do need more engagement with the private rented sector, either through making better use of existing arrangements or through new powers from scrutiny powers from government. But please, let's not interpret this recommendation as anything other than a discussion about relationships with social landlords, not private rented landlords. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Olivier, thank you. Mr. Lloyd-Owen, before we invite members to consider the position rather than their position.
I'd only add, Chair, that I'd be very happy to provide members across Cornwall with contact details for registered providers who provide homes in their areas, so that they can more readily raise issues of concern and complaint. And again, as I mentioned a little earlier, I think there is more that housing associations can do, both those national associations represented here and local associations, to engage local members and councils. No doubt more that we can do in respect of our own stock to engage local members and local councils in respect of investment plans and the services provided.
Okay. John, thank you. Councillor Rushworth, did you wish to come back with some sort of amendment proposal?
Well, I don't think it's going to achieve anything. I would like to say that can we vote on option 1, because I don't want to vote against or abstain from the other recommendations. But I just think that option 1 is, if I would say is where it says the condition of social housing in Cornwall in certain cases, or some word like certain, and I would be happy with that. But I don't think for a minute that 50% of the rented accommodation in Cornwall is below the standard of council houses. I just can't see that. Obviously there's people in private rented housing are going to go in more into food poverty because that's based on their income, and if they can't get social housing rents, then that's really the fault of the council not being able to provide the housing that these people need in the areas where they should be done. So either one or the other, I'm quite happy to go along with. If you take up recommendation 1 first and then the others afterwards, then I'll just abstain from 1. I don't know what if Mike wants to say anything else.
I've now got the Vice Chairman coming back in, so Councillor Duffin. Thank you, Councillor Rushworth.
I was just interested that Councillor Rushworth thought that it was the council's responsibility to provide housing for people, whereas we've always said that the public sector has a large responsibility and that councils couldn't possibly do it all. And I would have thought that with the government's policy on people being able to buy their council houses, that would make it even more difficult for councils to provide housing for everybody.
Can I come back? I need to come back on that.
Briefly, Councillor Rushworth, yes, then I've got Councillor Cole, then I will be moving to the vote.
I think Councillor Duffin's saying me completely out of context. I wasn't saying that at all. The private sector charge higher rates because they've got, they've got mortgages to pay and they've got everything else. Everybody's got to play a part in the housing process, and yes, we have got to deal with the rogue landlords. But the council, it's only the council can provide subsidised rents. Nobody else is going to provide subsidised rents. So I think that comment is completely taken out of context.
Councillor Rushworth, thank you. Councillor Cole.
I think we're going down a rabbit hole here. I agree with Joyce as well. In particular, the fact is what that statement says is a statistical reality. Social housing is of a higher standard statistically than private sector. It doesn't say all private sector is bad. It just says statistically social housing is of a higher standard and better quality. That's a reality. The evidence is there, and that's across Cornwall as a whole. There may be pockets where you can say this is fantastic. Others of us can show you areas where there are real problems with private sector housing, as in the previous report. So what's in front of us, we should just support it. It's a statistical reality.
Councillor Cole, thank you. Councillor Mike Thomas.
Statistical reality. I'd like to see the data. That's all. I don't see the data, and it's not a question of looking after the poor landlords. That's not the issue either. The irony for me is that there is certainly a landlord within my division that I would love to have accountable for, and his team and the property owner. I'm just of the feeling that, and I'm slightly more confused by what Councillor Ellenbrook has said and Councillor Olivia said, because why is there any reference whatsoever to the private rented sector in that preamble? Because number 1 is just isn't an option; it's a preamble to 1 to 5. So whoever wrote number 1, why did they have to reference the private rental sector? Because if the report was about social housing standards across the whole area, and particularly looking at corporate groups, I still don't understand why the private sector is referenced in a negative way.
Either way, in the absence of any proposed amendment, we will be coming to a vote very shortly. Councillor Duffin, I think you've had your say. So Councillor Towell, and then I'll look for someone to propose and second, and then we'll take the vote. Councillor Towell.
Yeah, I think Councillor Rushworth has come in with a suggestion that we separate out number 1, because there are a couple of references in there that I don't like and I couldn't support, but I'm quite happy with the bulk of the recommendations. So I think if could be separated out, we can vote on them separately and democracy will win the day.
Councillor Towell, thank you. I recognise the good intent in what you say. The challenge at the moment is the wording of 1 is effectively overarching small 1 to 5 as the detailed recommendations. So if we turn down 1 constitutionally, I'm not quite sure where we go in terms of the actual recommendations, the detailed recommendations themselves. So I welcome a view from Dem Services as to whether we can do that, bearing in mind the wording which exists and nobody's request to change it.
Thank you, Chairman. My recollection from the last meeting in November when we debated the private rented sector housing was that members were of the opinion that social housing was in the same state of repair as private rented sector housing. So they wanted some for the panel to reconvene to consider that, and that is why that was put down there, that it recognises the standard and condition of social housing in Cornwall exceeds that. So it's better than, or it, you know, statistically it has been better than, because there was some debate as to whether that was the case or not. So that was the reason why that was put that in. Certainly the recommendation that's in the paper on page 10 hasn't been proposed. I can see that Councillor Duffin is wanting to propose that, and it's not been seconded. So if we could...
It has. Councillor Pollard is wishing to second. Councillor Pollard is wishing to second Councillor Duffin's proposal.
So, okay, so Councillor Duffin has now proposed the recommendation on page 10 and 11 as set out. Would you like me to read that through for you?
Yes, I would. And what I would question Councillor Duffin and Councillor Pollard in proposing and seconding is, are you happy to take them individually? Because that will enhance the chances, I suspect, of more members supporting more of the recommendations, which will strengthen the position going into the new administration. Councillor Duffin.
As a member of the panel, we were shown this evidence. I have an issue that people are saying that they won't vote for actual evidence. It's beginning to feel a bit like Donald Trump. You know, because you don't like the evidence, you can't say it's not there. I wonder whether officers wanted to comment on the evidence that we were shown as part of the panel.
Councillor Duffin, could you answer my question as well, please, in relation to having proposed the recommendations as set out? Are you content, are you happy to take them individually to maximise the chances of the detailed recommendations being supported, which might carry a bit more weight with new council? Yes or no?
No, because it's not one of the points. It's the whole overarching reason the panel were asked to look at this.
You've answered my question. Thank you. Councillor Pollard, I guess as second, do you feel the same?
I do indeed, because I think what's being questioned is, as you've described, the preamble, not the small numbered points within the bulk of the recommendation. What members have been questioning is the preamble to it. No, I'm sorry, I'm proposing we take them as printed on page 10 and 11.
Okay, thank you. Lynn, would you like to read out the recommendations?
Yes, Chairman. The recommendation is that the committee recommends that the portfolio holder for homes recognises that overall the standard and condition of social housing in Cornwall exceeds that of private rented sector housing, but that more could be done, particularly in certain areas, to improve the social housing stock in Cornwall by putting in place the following. Number one, mechanisms to monitor the number of social housing properties in Cornwall not meeting the required standards, and B, the scale of the voluntary stock disposal within the social housing sector due to poor standards. Number two, better collaboration by social housing providers with the council, local members, town and parish councils on local investment plans to enable the formation of better strategic linkages. Number three, to lobby government to make changes to allow overview and scrutiny committees to better scrutinise and support the work of housing associations in its area. Number four, review the potential inequalities faced by leaseholders who have exercised their right to buy, particularly those in the ownership of Cornish unit properties. And number five, recognition that full and meaningful engagement by social housing providers with tenants was of great value and to be encouraged wherever possible. And I'll just take that to the vote with a roll call. So I'll go to Councillor Biscoe first.
For and leaving.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Cole.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Duffin.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Ellenbrook.
Reluctantly for.
Thank you. Councillor Frost.
For.
Councillor LeBroy.
For.
Councillor McKenna.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Towell.
Against.
Thank you. Councillor Olivier.
4.
Thank you. Councillor Pascoe.
4, reluctantly.
Councillor Pollard.
4.
Councillor Robinson.
4.
Councillor Rushworth.
Abstain.
And Councillor Thomas.
Abstain.
Thank you. Chairman, that's been carried. 12 votes for, 1 against and 2 abstentions.
Linda, thank you. And members, thank you for the debate we've just had. And I refer you now to page 23, item 7, the Economic Vitality of Rural and Coastal Areas Inquiry Final Report. Councillor LeBroy will introduce this, and David Rodder is supporting him where appropriate. And Lynn, I think you said because there are a number of recommendations, they would appear on screen. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. I will put them on screen and share my screen when Councillor LeBroy gets to those recommendations.
Thank you. Councillor LeBroy.
Jim, thank you very much indeed. So first of all, it would be right of me to thank the officers, in particular David Rodder and Lynn Davey, who helped us through this inquiry, but of course all the other officers of Cornwall Council as well that attended our sessions. Also fellow council members that took part in the inquiry, and of course all the expert witnesses who attended our online sessions and helped us through that particular process. The first thing that I wanted to say was that as we started to go through this process, it became pretty evident to me that it was going to end up being the partner to the Vitality of Towns inquiry. And I believe that the two inquiries are almost inseparable and should really be considered together. One of the things that came out of our discussions yesterday is that we're talking about key things that make Cornwall Cornwall. We saw also it's very important to give fair opportunities and try to provide a level playing field for people and our communities right across Cornwall. One of the things that shouldn't have surprised me, but did a little bit, was it reinforced how important some of the traditional industries, such as fishing, agriculture, tourism and mining, are to our community. And going back to that thing that I said a few moments ago, the key things that make Cornwall Cornwall, this is exactly the sort of stuff that we were talking about all the way through the inquiry. We did see that there are some massive challenges in the very near future coming up, particularly for the agricultural sector. Hand in glove with those, there are opportunities, but if we don't adjust some of our behaviour, if we don't promote and support some of these industries, there is a possibility that we might not make the most of these opportunities, and the time is now to actually recognise where those chances are for Cornwall. Some of the key things to my mind that I've just picked out are the connectivity issues, and these are things we've talked about in many other inquiries, both physical and virtual. They are critical to our future. Cornwall, of course, has an abundance of natural assets and the beauty of our open spaces, our clean beaches, that all together provide a great place to live and work and visit. Of course, we're in that sweet spot that's been described so many times for renewable energy. These are things that we, again, must grasp and make the absolute maximum that we possibly can from. But one of the things that's been on my mind is it's all very well to create a level playing field and a fertile field, but we must find ways of actually maintaining that value and retaining it within Cornwall itself. Towards the end of the process, we thought certainly that a pragmatic approach in terms of looking at the recommendations that are coming forward through the evidence would be to try to divide them into 3 subsections. Things in the first section, things that we can deliver right away with an adjustment of perhaps some of the work of the economic growth team. Item number 2, or recommendation number 2, were through existing resources, and item number 3 are things that are probably just a bit beyond us because we are right at the end of this administration, and that we'd be recommending that would be put forward for the new administration. So Lynn, if you could pop up Appendix 4, if that's possible to ask you to do that. And members, this starts on page 59 of the big numbers of your pack. Appendix number 4 is the recommendations to the decision makers, which I've described fall into 3 subsections. So the first part, going A through to N, you can see I'm not sure I should read those out in full unless the chairman particularly wants me to. Let me just refer back to the chair a moment for that.
Peter, I'm fine as they are, but I would wonder if Lynn could increase the size of the screen for anybody actually trying to follow this online.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so I will read through them as quick as I possibly can. So,
sorry.
Yeah, okay, so you can see that recommendation 1 are effectively housekeeping issues and things that we can do. I don't like using terms like low-hanging fruit, but they're things that can be done relatively easy within the economic growth department. Recommendation 2 are items that will actually require funding. And you can see that the Strategic Director for Economic Growth and Development, in consultation with the Section 151 officer, be requested to identify from existing resources up to £500,000 that could be used to support villages and their rural hinterlands to further their place shaping objectives. Recommendation number 3, and this is effectively the things that we're going to be asking the new administration to be looking at, encompasses from agriculture, tourism, fisheries, food, renewables and mining. And we believe that there could be fairly significant funding potentially available from central government sources such as the UK Levelling Up Fund, Shared Prosperity and the Renewal Fund coming forward, that we might be able to access some support for the activities that we are looking at there. So if I refer you back for a moment, I think Lynn, maybe if you could keep those on screen, but if I could refer members back to page 23, the recommendations that appear in the small box at the introduction of the item, which is that the Economic Growth and Development and Overview and Scrutiny Committee recommends to the appropriate decision maker, as detailed in section 4, which is up on screen now, that the Economic Vitality of Rural and Coastal Areas Member Inquiry Report be approved subject to any amendments the committee wishes to make. Now, Chair, I'd like, if that's okay with you, to formally propose that, but before we take a seconder, I imagine there might well be some debate on this subject.
Okay. Councillor LeBroy, thank you. Can I, as I did with the previous item, can I invite the Officer supporting David Flodder to comment, just if he has anything he wishes to draw members' attention to before we get into the wider member discussion?
Thank you, Chair. No, I think Councillor LeBroy covered it very well. The recommendations, there's a great deal of evidence there to back up each of the recommendations. I think it's a pragmatic approach of what's deliverable within current resources, and as he mentioned, there are a number of different funding streams that were announced in last week's budget, which may or may not be suitable for delivering some of the recommendations.
David, thank you, and Peter, thank you for the overview also. And it was I was on this particular panel. It was a pleasure to work on it, to be honest, not just because of the very high quality of the witnesses, but because of the collaborative approach between members, which you fostered. So it was genuinely a pleasure to actually sort of work on this. It is very necessary, and I very much hope that the new administration will take a lot of this forward. So thank you to you personally. Councillor Ellenbrook and then Councillor Jane Pascoe.
Thank you, Chair. On page 53 of the report, talking about tourism, it says tourism, Cornwall Council to seek secure funding to deliver a dedicated package, etc. And item 1 on that is really interesting, the potential of developing a circular route around Cornwall, which I think is to be applauded. Could I also ask that perhaps we also consider that if we're looking at tourism as, for want of a better word, an all year round event rather than just during the summertime, that we also should take into account the World Heritage Site that we have, and some of our coastal areas are part of the World Heritage Site. There's Hale and there's also St Agnes for 2. And that we actually expand our understanding of what tourism is, because there's a huge interest in Cornish history, the Cornish diaspora, all that, and I'm sorry that that hasn't been more recognised within this. And also cycling, you know, Cornwall Council is spending an extortionate amount of money, it seems to me, but I'm not an engineer, on putting in some cycleways around parts of Cornwall. But again, you know, should we not actually be looking at how we encourage people to use cycling as well? But as I say, I don't have any problem with the recommendations. It's just a thought.
Councillor Ellenbrook, thank you. Councillor Pascoe.
Thank you, Chair. I won't turn my camera on because my bandwidth is so weak. If you can hear me okay, if you don't mind. Yes. I personally would like to say a big thank you to David Rodder and Lynn Davey for their massive assistance through this inquiry, and also to Councillor Roy for chairing it so wonderfully well, and including the few members on the committee. And I am more than sure that Councillor Frost must be extremely disappointed that he wasn't able to make any of the witness sessions due to his work commitments. I think it was a very interesting inquiry, and it was one, as you probably may recall, that I'd asked for slightly in a different tone, but I think we got there in the end a long time back, and we moderated it to fit in with all these various asks. But it was extremely interesting, and the information and the evidence gathered was from over 30 witnesses. They were very long sessions. They were extremely interesting, but the poor chair had long and arduous days, and then Lynn had masses of notes to write up, so I thank you all for that. I think it goes some way to acknowledge our Indigenous industries in Cornwall. We need to make Cornwall sustainable, and also I think what's so important is the importance of the economic and social interaction between rural areas and indeed coastal areas and the towns that they surround. I believe, as Councillor LeBroy says, that this actually can go in hand with the Vitality of Towns inquiry. This is something we didn't cover off in that if we've got a vibrant rural economy, then a market town will also benefit. So I am really happy that it's finally come through the system, and I hope you can all support it in some way.
Jane, thank you very much. Dick Cole, you're next.
Thank you, Jim. I've got quite a bit to say, which hopefully Peter will see as positive. So if you could bear with me, please.
Can you do it within 2 minutes, Councillor Cole, starting now?
I doubt it, but if you could please bear with me, it is important stuff, hopefully. Obviously a significant amount of work's gone into this report, and I think it's got a series of really positive recommendations in a range of sectors, which is great. I also note, which as you'd expect me to say, it's good that the complexity and the different nature of the non-urban areas across Cornwall is acknowledged. I mean, that's really, really important. I think maybe one little criticism, I'm not sure we do get completely under the skin of that, given the level of the complexities, if I might be as cheeky to say how Bude operates and the areas around Bude operate together, and how somewhere like the China Clay operates. But again, that I'll leave that there. And I think this work's been pretty much about economic vitality, and I think we need to do a bit more work going forward to actually get under the skin of how these communities operate and the levels of investment from the council and the public sector, away from just pure economic investment, for example. So, but that's all for the future. In terms of the recommendation, I would seek some slight amendments if that was possible, and if necessary, I'd be happy to move, but if I throw them out there and see what Peter and the panel thinks, if they might wish to incorporate a couple of them. Under recommendation 1B, which is the rural proofing, again, rural proofing is very, very important, and I think I remember attending many meetings on this with David Rodder in different guises over many years. So this is really fundamental stuff. However, under rural proofing, under reasons, it says there will be an audit report on the rural-urban split of where Cornwall Council spends its economic development budget. That's fantastic. That needs to happen. I would question, could we have that as a full recommendation, please? That we turn that text in, the supporting text, into a recommendation, which gives a commitment to actually do that audit, but also potentially that it could go a little bit further, so that we actually look at where the council basically spends its pounds, regardless of whether it's economic development or something else, for example in the provision of services. I think that would be a real positive. So that's building on the recommendation, so hopefully that might be acceptable. The second point is quite small. Again, it's recommendation 1, and this time it's bullet point M, and this is the provision of new workspaces where need, and it says where need can be identified. I question whether we need to say where we have to justify it through need, because quite often, again, I'll take my own area as an example. We've got strategic industrial estates because our rural areas happen to be on the A30 trunk road through Cornwall. So I think it would just be better if we were just talking about the provision of workspaces and not having to say there has to be where a need can be identified. You know, it's just to promote it without that caveat, if you like. I hope that made sense, because I think that, like I said in my evidence, the China Clay area, again, we're actually providing employment space and office space at twice the rate of our local plan. So again, I think that's just a positive. Recommendation 2 is talking about the resource for place shaping, which is fantastic. And again, I would query whether it needs a tiny bit of rewording. The actual recommendation states about villages and rural hinterlands, but then in the reasoning beneath it, it actually talks about specific broader non-urban areas. It actually says Clay area, the Lizard and the Roseland. So I just think it would be tighter if the actual recommendation actually basically said resource for place shaping for rural, coastal, non-urban areas. So it's broader. There's also a reference in the document to the evidence I gave about the China Clay strategy document that was produced by the network, which was the network manager working with councillors. And I'm quoted as saying all network panels should do one. I just wanted to be clear, I was responding to members of the inquiry and we were having a chat before we really got going about how that would be helpful. I mean, I think my key point is we need parity between non-urban and urban areas, and it's been frustrating that resource has been given for officers to produce documentation for some areas. In other areas we've had to literally do it ourselves, so it's getting away from that.
Okay.
Almost there.
Good.
The allocation in this section says of up to 50,000. So the first thing I would say is elsewhere in the document, like under recommendation 3, the wording is at least. So when we're talking about specific agricultural or fishing proposals, it says at least 150,000 per annum for 3 years, for example. But here we're talking about up to. So I would just ask the question now whether or not that should actually be a bit more positive and say at least 500,000. And my big question here is, how does that relate to expenditure in the urban areas? What's the quantum that we're achieving here between place shaping for the rural and place shaping for the urban? What's the quantum between the two? Because I think that would be useful for us to know going forward. It's what percentage do the two equate to each other? And my last comment is under recommendation 3, which is again all great stuff. I just wonder. Again, I've questioned my request for the audit, if you like, of expenditure and activity that I said might be a recommendation. Potentially that could also be included under recommendation 3 to show it going forward. Hopefully that was really positive and helpful, but I'll stop there. So
Councillor Cole, it certainly demonstrates you've read the document thoroughly, so thank you very much. I think one or two of those will be follow-ups rather than anything else. I'm sure Councillor Roy can reflect once we come to the end of member sort of comments. I've got next Councillor Olivier, then Councillor Frost.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've got a few points to make, and possibly a recommended amendment, or an amendment to the recommendation, I should say, but I'd like to hear what people think. Firstly, I note on page 34, there was a reference to St Ives being number 5 in the World TripAdvisor top 10 for places to visit, St Ives. Now, we all know that St Ives is like one of the most successful tourist destinations in Britain. What perhaps there is less awareness of, that last March, before the pandemic kicked off, it came top of the Cornwall Council League table for towns with where households with dependent children were living in a state of poverty. So in spite of its enormous success as a tourist destination, it's still got a high level of poverty, an unusually high level of poverty among its local families. A really sort of overwhelming piece of evidence that relying on a visit economy isn't going to make Cornish communities prosperous, or at least not many of the people living within those communities. And I think we should never lose sight of that when we're talking about the visitor economy. That stat just jumped out of that reference just jumped out of me when I read the report. Now, the other, I've got two questions which may reflect that I hadn't examined the report in as much detail as Dick clearly has. But in the areas for sort of prioritising, I didn't see any mention of aerospace, because I thought that was one of our, we're talking of coastal locations. There's a very obvious coastal location where that might be a consideration. Is there a reason for that it wasn't within the remit, that type of industry wasn't within the remit of the report? And the other one, and again, I missed it, may have missed it, is the feasibility of a tourism tax, something that's been discussed on and off for quite a long period of time. So tourism tax, aerospace. And then when we come to page 48, you've got at the top, recommendation L, undertake an initial feasibility study into the advantages, disadvantages and potential of developing a voluntary contribution scheme, so on and so forth, for people who've got domestic premises registered as holiday let properties which aren't paying in council tax or business rates because of the small business rates exemption. Why not a feasibility study into having a tourism tax? I mean, nobody's in a better position to put forward a case for that than Cornwall Council. So that just seemed a bit narrow. And again, this may reflect my inattention to your proceedings rather than a genuine point, a more genuine point.
Olivier, thank you.
Can I come back later then about my proposed amendment?
If you want, if you have something specific and the wording agreed, the wording in your head at least, by all means float it now.
Float it now. Oh, okay. Sorry, I was quite happy to come back if other people wanted to speak, Chair.
There are other people wanting to speak, but I'm keen to move the debate on. So if you have something you want us to consider now, fine. If not, you can come back for a minute at the end.
Well, I'd like to ask the Chair's response to the point I made about why not a feasibility study. Could we not change the recommendation into a feasibility study, or supplement it for a tourism tax, a tourism levy? I'd like to know if he feels that feasible. And then the other, that's the trouble is here. I'll come back for a minute later on another point if you don't mind, Chair. Sure. Sorry.
That's fine. You will be timed.
Yeah.
Councillor Lee Frost.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's as Councillor Pascoe mentioned, I was on this panel but had very limited involvement, unfortunately, due to my nature of work, being put into a national lockdown when this task and finish group was ongoing, made it very difficult for me. I think weirdly I'm going to talk about other committees now, because I did try to get myself swapped out for someone else once I realised I wasn't going to be able to make these commitments, but that's not possible. So maybe Councillor Pollard might want to look into that in another committee to make that possible in the future. And I just wanted to mention about Councillor Cole's point on the audit, the rural urban split audit. I think that's actually something that's really important, and I sat on the task and finish group and the customers committee regarding where Cornwall spends its money and the Cornish pound and all that sort of stuff. And actually, this is drilling down in a bit of detail that I think would be really beneficial to what the council can do and look at how it spends its budget. So if Councillor Cole was making that as a recommendation into the proposal, I would happily second that one. But otherwise, I think this is a really good document and gives us a good platform to actually get things moving.
Lee, thank you very much. David, it's David Rodder. It was remiss of me. I haven't invited you to comment on anything yet. Is there anything you wish to advise at this stage, or do you want to possibly come in at the end?
I think probably coming in at the end, Jim. I think.
Fine.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, Councillor Dwelly and then Councillor Thomas, and it appears that Councillor Olivier has formulated his wording after that. The Councillor Dwelly, come in, please. Okay, I'll move on to Councillor Thomas. Tim, let me know when you're available to come back after Councillor Thomas.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Peter, for what you've done in this and all the other officers involved. A very straightforward question, simple one. Would you agree with me that perhaps of the 5 recommendations, the most difficult one might be connecting Cornwall due to the issues of climate change, reconciling the problem of journeys and the issue of climate change agenda? And also that the costs involved in actually making a real difference to connectivity between rural villages and the towns that they connect with. So I'm really asking you, would you say that the most difficult of your recommendations perhaps might be connecting Cornwall?
Come back now if you want, Councillor Boy. That's a fairly straightforward question.
They're all probably quite difficult, Mike, to be honest. I think we had some ideas and discussions around some non-linear transport ideas, and that is looking at ways of connecting communities, rural communities, by transport that isn't necessarily a bus or a train going from A to B on a timetable. And I don't want to be too prescriptive about what that might or might not be, but it could be anything from sort of relatively small electric car hire clubs situated in villages and accessible at very low rates to people to share. It could be buses. When I say buses, I mean small vehicles, sort of 10 to 12 seaters, maybe, that are on demand, ready to act as taxi type services, perhaps in an environmentally friendly fashion. But then also going on to rethink how our transport hubs actually operate, and that we could maybe step down our transport hubs so we have more strategic hubs in smaller towns which go on to serve the larger strategic hubs. But I don't want to be prescriptive, other than notice, or in my opinion, there is an opportunity to chuck away the rule book and rethink entirely what public transport does and how it works.
Yes. If I may just briefly come back, I think you could have a whole working party find out all of those issues completely, and I think some brilliant ideas there. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Thank you, Councillor Broy. I remember, Councillor Broy, the example you gave is somebody trying to negotiate the trip from Newquay Airport to Bude within a day, which was clearly something of a challenge. And it was an eye-opener, I have to say, because we think we're a little isolated in the Far West. So that brings Councillor Dwelly up to the screen. Councillor Dwelly.
Thank you, Jim. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to give some feedback from how this is playing out, going through into Cabinet and into the various parts of the economic growth team and how they can help. I think there's some great stuff in here, and I think as things stand, the proposals could go through, hopefully unamended, through Cabinet, etc. Or, I mean, obviously some of this may well be for the next administration, but in terms of how things stand at the moment and the team set up to deliver vitality, etc., I think the key thing that helped the process in terms of it feeding through is on page 26, and that was where, thank you to Pete LeBroy and to David Rodder for effectively taking a large number of recommendations and turning them into categories. So if you see there that some of these are existing resources, recommendation 1 is existing resources, 2 is very much for where we get outside funding in. That's recommendation 2. So we're obviously looking at the Levelling Up Fund, the community programme coming through as in year 1 of Shared Prosperity Fund, and so on and so forth. And longer term recommendations. But the one thing I'm pleased to have done all I can to help with here is to identify £500,000 as real funds for this, and I've done so with Phil Mason, looking hard at the amount of money we were beginning to allocate into the town deals, and recognising that there would be some of that money, what might have been 8 million for those 4 towns, that might not be required. So that money, of course, is revenue funding as well as capital. So it's really important, because a lot of what you're proposing is revenue. And I think that's the way to go. I definitely wouldn't have personally been in favour of reducing the town vitality funds to do this. I think this should be additional, not instead of. And I'm really pleased that I believe the panel think that too. That's great. But just in terms of the discussions that have been had so far, one thing I think from experience of practical delivery is worth you all bearing in mind, please, is that we now have learned a lot of lessons on town vitality delivery and how important it is to focus on deliverable things with a place to them. So I think the focus on villages is really important. And I'm not saying instead of other things, but if you keep focus on villages, you may well get a lot more delivered. So I personally would be, if I were on the committee, averse to trying to see this thing as doing absolutely everything for everyone everywhere. I think that was how it initially might have come across. So keeping the focus is more likely to see officers spend time and money flowing, and it will also leverage in government money. Thank you.
Councillor Dwelly, thank you. I would say that members are obviously at liberty on the committee to propose amendments if they think they will improve the report itself. So, and the chairman of the panel can cover that shortly. Yeah. So, thank you. Councillor Olivier, have you got your head together and you've got a proposal by way of?
Yeah, well, I've always got my head together, but really what I wanted to know from the chair was why he had, before I proposed him, was there a reason why you didn't consider the possibility of a tourism levy that's been discussed on many occasions before, but rather confining yourself to this voluntary scheme for holiday let business premises? So I wanted to ask that question before moving on, Chair, to the main point. So if you could answer that.
I'm going to attempt to answer it, Cornelius, because it is obviously quite a difficult question. But the tourist tax, I think, was something that was seen as a bit of an iron fist and a fairly heavy-duty measure, whereas the proposals that we brought forward were something that we thought could be supported, especially by people that are owning those properties that probably have benefited from some sort of government support, and that on this scheme moving forward successfully, and perhaps getting some experience under our belt over the period of maybe 2-3 years, that if it was successful, that perhaps a tourist tax might be something that could come out of that. But it was an entry level attempt to address the question of financially supporting agencies such as Visit Cornwall to have some level of funding to be able to deliver some of the strategy recommendations, such as extending the tourist season and also extending into all of the corners of Cornwall where visitors are actually going, and trying to prevent some of the over tourism issues that we perhaps might have in, say, let's say St Ives. But yes, I think maybe not going with the iron fist and going with something that would be perhaps more palatable in terms of a measure that could be adopted and supported by a much wider cross section of the community and the tourist delivering community.
Right. Okay, Chair. Before I actually sort of come up with what I'm suggesting, if we look at page 48.
Could I encourage you to progress this reasonably quickly, Councillor?
Yeah, I have every intention of doing that, Chair, because. Yeah, I do. So the CEO of Visit Cornwall and the Vice President of the Country Land and Business Association both expressed considerable concern about the impact of holiday let business premises on housing supply and the anomaly of so many of them not actually paying either council tax or business rates. So the people who came evidence from leading Cornwall organisations raised this. So I do think your proposal in L is a bit of an anticlimax, to be honest. It's almost a sidestep. They said, oh, it's causing a really bad housing problem, and you didn't really address that. Now, you may not have felt that was within the remit of your inquiry, and I understand that.
Right.
What I am proposing for L, right, is that undertake an initial feasibility study into the disadvantages of a voluntary contribution from holiday accommodation prices, that we add and the possibility of a wider tourism levy on tourism businesses, that we add that wording in at the end, because we're talking about feasibility study. The feasibility study can decide whether or not it's a two iron fist or not, I think. But to decide to decide in advance that it's an iron fist, therefore we're not going to even see if it's feasible, seems a bit premature. You're closing off an avenue that's been discussed a lot. So
okay, Olivier.
So that's what I would suggest. Yeah.
Thank you, Lynn. You've got that. So it's a relatively small number of words. Just before we do sort of try and pull this together, you've got that that wording from Councillor Olivier, hopefully.
Yes, Chairman, I have. I hope I've got this right. It just says at the end of L, and possibility of introducing a tourism levy on businesses. Is that correct?
Yeah, a tourism levy. Yeah, a tourism levy paid by local tourism businesses and recycled into the tourism industry, in developing the tourism industry. It's a good job Lynn's used to my style of speech, right after the private rate sector inquiry. Does that make sense to you, Lynn?
Yeah, I think, can you just say that a little bit slower so I can just write that down?
I do apologise for that. Right, we've got to, and the right. So the feasibility, undertake an initial feasibility study that, and the feasibility of a tourism levy on tourism businesses for recycling into the development of the Cornish tourism industry. I'm sorry if that's not grand. Does that? Is that at least make the point, even if it's not too grammatically coherent right now?
I'll leave Lynn to sort of work through that and put it into some sort of grammatical sense. Can I congratulate you on waking up, or not waking up perhaps, but animating a number of members, because having thought we were going to the vote about now, I now have 5 more members wishing to speak, which is a little frustrating. So hopefully those members will keep things succinct.
Personally, I blame the chair of the inquiry for not addressing
I blame the on member for Penzance Central personally, but there we go. So, Councillor Rushworth, is it Councillor Olivier's point you wish to address?
Yes, I agree with Councillor Olivier, as long as the money is ring-fenced to go back into tourism, and I don't think the tourist industry would mind that.
Okay, second that.
No, 1 second. Before I say that, but are we voting on something we can't deliver? You know, I don't think.
I think Councillor Rushworth, the suggestion was investigate the feasibility. So that's not the same as actually trying to impose it, is it? It's evaluating whether we could.
Spending money on lots of things that we can't, you know, when we get there, we can't do, and I don't think that we have the power to do it personally.
That's okay. So as and when it comes in as an amendment.
Make one comment to Councillor Lewis, and we all agree that, you know, we should the quicker we get rid of people in social deprivation, the better. But I just like to put this question to you know, into him. If St Ives and say all the tourism in Cornwall suddenly had lost 50% of its income, would that lead to more deprivation or less?
I'm talking about economic diversification.
Councillor Olivier, that sounds like a question for a phone call when we have a break and when we have lunchtime. It's certainly not going to be debated by the pair of you at this meeting. But Councillor Rushworth, thank you. Councillor Jane Pascoe.
As a member of the panel, and I'd like to concur with the chair as well on this, but I don't think that was the point of what we were trying to get over. And you can beat people with sticks like you want to beat the private landlords, and you can beat the tourists, but if you ask them for help and to work with us and make that contribution, because they're actually getting small business rate relief, I think you've got more chance of them working together with us to achieve what we want. And I think that tourism thing is a different matter, and it shouldn't be included, tourism tax, in this actual recommendation. I don't know what Councillor Boy feels about that, but we did have long discussions about it on the panel.
Jane, thank you. We did indeed, and Councillor Bloy, I think, will have the challenging issue of summing up, hopefully rather shortly. Councillor Towell.
Yeah, I'm just asking for some clarification really on this point of a study of the tourism tax. What exactly are we looking into the logistics of? Is it the logistics of levying, Cornwall Council levying this tax? Is it a look at the legality of what we can do, or is it a look at the effect that this tax will have on the industry, which is a very important industry for Cornwall, and whether we should even think about levying extra taxes on them, particularly at this point in time? I think, you know, the industry does need a certain amount of stability going forward.
Agreed. Councillor Towell, I suspect in fact I know that the biovaluation, the intention will be to establish the legality, because clearly if we can't do it, then the investigation would stop at that point. It might then be a request to lobby, but certainly the starting point has got to be, do we have or could we develop the powers to do it? Councillor Pollard.
Thank you, Jim. I won't delay things. I just wanted to make that point. That certainly every time we've looked at tourism tax in the past, we haven't got the ability, capability, or legal ability to implement one. What I wanted really, and I hope Peter will cover this in his summing up, is some comment from the committee on this proposal, because clearly the conversation has indicated that they didn't go down the line of a tourism tax, and they've done the work, and therefore if that's continues their view, then I won't be able to support Councillor Livier's amendment.
Councillor Pollard, thank you. Councillor Frost, and then I'm going to bring in David Rodder.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I was just going to ask if we have that power to actually levy it, and my only comment would be, I do think the debate around tourism tax is one we should have, but I don't necessarily feel we should just gerrymander it into this report. I think it's worthy of its own, maybe even working group at some point, to look in it properly and give it the insight that it needs.
Lee, thank you very much. David Rodder.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just to cover a few of the points that were raised, and I'll come to the voluntary contribution first. I think the key bit of the panel is this is a voluntary contribution, not a tax. You know, the tax, tourism tax, has all sorts of issues relating to it, legality, how you'd collect it, and as well as other issues with it. Whereas a voluntary contribution is about working, as has been mentioned by members, working with the industry to try and deliver what the industry was asking for, which is spreading the benefit out across Cornwall, about extending the season, more experiential activity, so that the benefits of tourism are felt by more than just the most popular areas of Cornwall. That would need funding to deliver. Some of that might well come from some of the future government funding schemes that are around, but it was also felt that at this time, given that a number of those businesses that don't pay business rates or council tax, as Councillor Boy said, have benefited from the various government grants which they've been entitled to, is a good opportunity to engage them in this discussion, to work with us. So it is a voluntary contribution, not a tax. And the feasibility study, because there was a comment I think from Councillor Rushworth about spending lots of time working on it. At its very basic level, it's a questionnaire to those businesses that are on the register about their thoughts, the payment rates, if they were going to pay it, what would it be used for. So it's quite resource light to start with. If we get some positive noises and if there's a good body of people wanting to do it, we can explore that further. but it's trying to focus on what's deliverable now, rather than perhaps the wider issue about the tax regime. So hopefully that helps that one there. In terms of some of the other comments that have been picked up, I'll leave Councillor Broy sum up on that, but I think Councillor Cole's point about where workspace and where need can be identified, we probably should have added opportunity in there, because there are opportunities to create workspace across Cornwall. So that is one way of raising that. And his question about the allocations of rural and town, the town centre vitality, the panel recognised that many of the towns that would be eligible to build into the town vitality fund are rural by nature. Yeah. So it isn't quite as simple as saying all the town funding is urban, and therefore we've got a disproportionately less amount. A lot of those towns are rural and they can bid into the town centre vitality fund. This specific recommendation 2 is around those villages and areas around them that cannot bid into the town centre vitality fund.
David, thank you. Peter, are you somewhere close to having a handle on exactly what amendments are being proposed? I include Councillor Coles in those as well.
I think I'm quite happy with where I'm going to go with Cornelius's suggestion. Dick's ones I'm a little bit more confused, if that makes sense, over, but perhaps we can come back to those in a few seconds.
Yes, certainly. I think we can possibly look at doing that now. Councillor Dwelly's put in the chat bar, the last Council's Economy Committee looked at tourism tax. It became apparent it wasn't legally possible. One assumes that's still the case, but there's no harm, I suspect, in trying to persuade government to change its policy on that, should that be the view of members.
Well, could I come in a bit later when we come to this point, Chair?
Yes, what I'm trying to do is move to a vote before 12 o'clock. Now, Councillor Cole, you had a number of proposed amendments. Lynn, are you on standby?
Yes, I am, Chairman.
Excellent. Councillor Cole, we don't need the preamble. We simply need any proposed amendments you have to see whether those and Councillor Olivier's get a seconder, and therefore we can consider them.
Okay, Chairman. I mean, the first one, and I was hoping that Peter and the team would take this as a was simply the commitment to do an audit or a report on the rural-urban split in terms of investment. Actually was made a formal recommendation rather than being in the support text, possibly, and it to be slightly broadened out, that we look to get a grip a bit more on general expenditure as well. I would have thought that would be a simple one that we could all liaise around without, and for it to be modified through Peter rather than myself. So I'll throw it back to him if that's okay, to see what he thinks.
Okay, so that's the first one. Lynn, have you got that?
Sorry, Councillor Cole, did you have any specific wording there? So the wording currently is ensure that Cornwall Council comprehensive impact appraisal process is fully rural proofed. And what wording was it you had there?
Sorry, if you look in the supporting text.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, here we go. It's the last line of the reasons, which talks about in addition. This will include an audit report on the rural-urban split of where Cornwall Council spends its economic development budget. I think that should be a standalone recommendation, because it's such an important and a positive thing.
Okay.
And I would ask that it be caveated that it looks slightly broader at general expenditure in terms of Cornwall Council and the wider public sector.
So to include general expenditure by Cornwall Council.
Jim, if I might just come back on that, I don't think I've got any problem whatsoever with that, but some of the nuances of how these things are dealt with, especially on an officer level, do sometimes confuse me. And I'd just like David Rodder to tip me the wink that would be okay and deliverable, because what I don't want to do is to set forward and put forward a set of recommendations that aren't workable.
Fine, David.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Broy. I think there's a few issues in that. Is that it's not always easy or straightforward to badge expenditure as purely rural or urban. Yeah. So, you know, if you're investing in bus services or train investment or those sorts of things, that benefits everybody equally, theoretically anyway. So the splitting it just on rural urban is not easy. And we've been around that one before. I think I'll be guided by Lynn and others procedurally. This is the Economic Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I'm not sure you can commit other services to do a rural-urban split. We can say we'll do it for Economic Growth Service, and I've had conversations with Glenn and Phil about doing that. We can do it. We can do that relatively straightforwardly, in the understanding that it isn't simple to just put rural-urban split.
Okay,
Jim, if I can help, if I can help. I fully accept the caveats about rural urban, but obviously that's already in the report. On the wider expenditure, I'm happy to put the caveats in where possible, so that there's not 100% commitment, but that it will happen, but it's a positive thing to look at if we could. I think that hopefully that would be acceptable to Peter.
If it improves the strength of this report, it's acceptable. Okay. What I don't want to do is to put a report forward that is undeliverable. No.
Okay, I'll come back to Lynn to try and sum this up with you, Peter, in a minute. So if we don't get this resolved in the next 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to invite you guys to carry on the discussion while the rest of us have a 10-minute break. So carry on, Councillor Cole.
The second one was about about the employment space, where it says where need can be justified, whereas I think Peter's already not Peter. David's already said we could reword that to talk about opportunities, because I think it's a key point. Some of the employment land in rural areas is very, very strategic in nature. So, and yet it was written as if you're having to justify it. So.
David has picked that up. So thank you. So next one.
Is Peter happy?
I'm happy to add opportunity. Yes.
Sorry, Chairman, can we just hang on a minute? I'm just trying to find this because I'm typing this up as you're saying it, and then I'm going to share the screen, which we can do probably later. Yeah. So that's in M, isn't it? So facilitate the development of new workspaces in rural and coastal areas where the need can be identified. Did you say it's facilitate the opportunity? Was that
it? Chair, if I may, no.
Thank you.
I think, Lynn, what it's facilitate the development of new workspaces in rural and coastal areas where the need and opportunity can be identified. Or opportunity, probably.
And
thank you to members of the public watching this. This is a very complex report. We don't normally have this level of discussion around amendments, but on this occasion we are. Councillor Cole, do you have much more?
The last one, it's the recommendation 2. Where it specifically talks about place shaping being to support villages and rural hinterlands, whereas the examples given are in the supporting text are Clay Country, Lizard Peninsula, Roseland Peninsula, so it's a wider area. So I just think because the wording of the recommendation doesn't really work for Clay Country, but if you just change that to say rural coastal areas full stop, it is all encompassing, and I just think that makes a lot of sense.
That sounds like a fairly minor but sensible tweak. Councillor Broy, are we happy with that?
Yeah.
Thank you. Lynn, do we have the wording?
Yes, I do, Chairman. Thank you.
And the other thing was it's whether or not I always fear when we have a comment in saying up to 50,000, because that could be 25p. I know that's been a little bit cynical. I know the commitment's 500. And it's whether we can say we should be looking to do at least 500,000 rather than up to. It's just a slight point. It gives us the rural areas a bit of ambition to push it.
Dick, I think the challenge would be the 151 would say that if all rural areas wanted that, we wouldn't be able to do it. So, I mean, maybe range might be sensible rather than up to.
It's just the term at least is used elsewhere in the document for other funding schemes. So.
Okay. All right. Peter, are you happy with that? At least 50,000?
I'm happy with the principle of it, but I go back to what I said before. If it's something the Section 151 officer will have to object to or find a problem with, I don't want to scupper the report on the basis of a nuance of wording.
So if we could suggest a guide, 50,000.
I'm happy with guide, and that I think, well, I hope that would satisfy the 151 officer. I'd appreciate a comment from David on that.
Peter, actually the wording of around £500,000 would probably be, I think, would probably be the best, wouldn't it?
I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
Mr. Rodder, do you wish to comment?
No, Chair, not on that.
Okay, so I think Councillor Olivier had a form of words he wished to see added. He'll need a seconder for that. But I'll invite you to read that out in a second. Then Councillor Cole's clutch of proposals. We'll take those, I suspect, to see if they're seconded. If they both are, they can presumably then form part of the substantive recommendations, which I really look forward to going through shortly. So,
Chairman, can I just ask about Councillor Olivier's? That was around the tourism levy. Is that something that you wanted me to put in?
Or is he happy it's being addressed?
Yeah, I know there was some debate about that.
I can guess which way it's going to go.
Right. Well, I think no. I would like to propose it. I mean, you did invite me to come back in very briefly. What I'm proposing is a feasibility study, into whether it is economically desirable and administratively, possible. I know it's not legal, but if it's economically desirable, administratively feasible, then we can ask the government for it. And it just seems a bit half-hearted not to address that issue when it's been discussed so many times over so many years in Cornwall. Oh, and for information, because David Rodder raised this point, the businesses that we're talking about levying, asking for voluntary contributions from, since the pandemic began, have between them received 110 million in COVID grants.
So Olivier, thank you. I'm keen
got
to
a
bring
lot
this to a
to
conclusion, not to populate your election leaflet. So, could we please take a final view? Lynn, have you got the wording from Councillor Olivier?
Can I share the screen with you and then you can see the? Okay. Can you let me know when you can see it? Because
yes, you can see that.
You can see this. I undertake an initial feasibility study into the advantages, disadvantages, and potential of developing a voluntary contribution scheme for holiday accommodation providers who are registered for small business relief to make a voluntary financial contribution to Cornwall Council. And I still haven't got this. And the possibility of introducing a tourism levy on businesses. Councillor Olivier.
It's levy rather than level, then, but yeah.
Sorry. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I can understand that it's difficult to follow. Okay, so that being the case, Councillor Olivier, you're proposing that amendment in red. Do we have a seconder?
Yeah, I'm happy to second it. I think we can do both at the same time. It can't be that difficult.
Chairman, can I just ask, so is Councillor Olivier proposing that the whole all of the recommendations within the report on section 4, which is the recommendation 1 with all its subparts, of which we've made some amendments to, recommendation 2 with some of the amendments which Councillor Cole has put in, and recommendation 3, is he proposing all of those and Councillor Duffin seconding it? Can I just get clarification on that, please?
Yes, I think that.
So we're taking it on block?
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Olivier, you're happy with that?
He's probably gone for a lie down. You won't be the only one.
Councillor Olivier? Sorry, I'd been muted. But
sorry, that wasn't me.
I thought it was the chair.
Right,
no, I'm happy with that.
Fine,
yeah.
okay. So we're taking them on block.
We're taking them on block. Does anybody want to see those again? Can you see that on the screen? Can you see that? So they are as set out on page 59, 60 and 61 of the agenda that's been published. And then there are some changes to recommendation 1B, which will include in red, I think you can see it on the screen, to include an audit report on the rural/urban split of where Cornwall Council spends its economic development budget to include general expenditure. Is that right? Have I got that correct?
That's one of Councillor Cole's, I believe, yes.
Yeah.
Can I just come in, sorry?
Yeah, of course.
With this general expenditure, you know, if you say the wider expenditure of Cornwall Council, and I said it should be as a separate action. It needs to be a separate recommendation, so it stands apart. So to include, to carry out an audit or whatever. So
what you're saying is this is going to be C.
Yeah, it'll just bump down, won't it? But
is that okay?
So
to include the wider expenditure,
carry out an audit
of Cornwall Council. Is that correct? Have I got that right? Yeah. Okay.
I'm not hearing anybody saying no, so I'd move on.
So the next one that's had a slight change as I'm going through. This is this is M, little m, recommendation 1, little m, and the possibility of introducing a tourism levy on businesses.
Okay.
Happy with that?
Yeah, I'm happy with that as long as it's clearly understood that that is for the purpose of reinvesting in tourism, the tourism industry.
I think somebody else made that point earlier, Cornelius. Thank you.
Okay, and then we've got the word opportunity, facilitate the development of new workspaces in rural and coastal areas where the need or opportunity can be identified. Then in recommendation 2, we've it's been changed from identify from existing resources of around £500,000, and then it's got and their place shaping objectives for rural and coastal areas.
On that one, Lynn, you need to lose the word villages and as well to support place shaping objectives for rural and coastal areas.
Okay, and then on recommendation 3.
Lynn, can you go back to that, please?
Yeah.
Have we got rural and coastal areas in there anywhere? So we've taken out.
At the bottom in red.
Thank you.
And then on recommendation 3, there's no changes here. Is that correct?
Excellent. So let's move on quickly then. So can I ask then, in terms of the process here, where we have added things in, is it legitimate to go and take them all with those proposed amendments, or do we need to consider the appetite for the proposed amendments first?
No, Chairman, they have been proposed and seconded as a block with those amendments in them. This is what's on the table. This is so it's been taken on block.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes. So before we go to the vote by roll call, I will firstly ask Councillor Towell, who indicated a wish to speak, and then Councillor LeBroy hopefully can say in 30 seconds how happy he is. He can smell his lunch and he's thinking he might want to taste it. So, Councillor Towell.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in earlier on the tourism tax part of this. I did take the view that it should have been separated out. Because it does seem like it's going to be a substantial workload for our officers on a subject that really the council collectively hasn't really given a direction on. It just sort of that one amendment sort of separates it out from the others, I think, because of its workload, and it's something I feel quite skeptical about. And it will have an impact on the way I vote on block, I think, whereas if it was taken out, I would feel a bit more comfortable in supporting the rest of the text.
Okay, I'll bring in Councillor LeBroy at this point as the chair of the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I personally don't particularly like that one either, but I'm happy to go with the process that the meeting has somehow developed itself into. I always thought that when, and I don't want to delay this anymore because I'd like a coffee and a visit to the loo and everything else, but I always thought that when we did amendments, we voted on amendments separately.
So did I. That was why I was asking the question.
So I'm just a little bit confused about the process, if I'm honest, because personally I would have probably voted down Cornelius's proposal, but I was happy to accept all of Dick's. I don't know if there's room to do that without it causing loads of fuss.
I thought we were still going to vote on Cornelius's separately. I thought Cornelius's was an amendment. I thought that we were going to vote.
That was exactly the question I asked, and I was advised, at least I think I was advised, that we weren't. So.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Well, Chairman, who did propose this? Councillor Olivier had proposed this, didn't he?
Yeah.
And Councillor Duffin has seconded it.
Yes.
Yes, so Councillor Olivier is going to put those proposals in, and this is the first proposal on the table. So this is the recommendation that's being put forward for the committee to vote on. By Councillor Olivier and seconded by Councillor Duffin. Now, Councillor Duffin may think differently now. I wish for that element to be taken out and then and vote on it as a whole without 1L being there, and we vote on that separately.
Can I propose, Jim, we take them separately? Simple proposal.
I think that would be sensible. That would resolve the issue. And I mean, this is becoming a little shambolic, which is not helpful. So I do agree, laborious though it may be, that we take the recommendations separately, as suggested by Councillor Pollard. I will second that. In fact, I will suggest that from the chair.
I'm happy to go along with that, Chair.
That's fortunate because that's what we're doing. So Councillor Olivier, thank you.
Chair, is only one that we are voting on, surely, that may or may not, which is Cornelius's one.
No, because Councillor Duffin, if you noticed, Councillor Cole also had several in red that we worked through. There are a number of these. So therefore, in my judgment, bearing in mind the time we've taken to get to this point, unless Councillor LeBroy disagrees, we take the recommendations individually. That's been suggested by Councillor Pollard, who is also Chairman of Constitution and Governance. I think it's the safest way. It might not be the quickest, but it's the safest way to proceed, in the knowledge that whatever is determined stands and is constitutionally appropriate. So I'm happy with that. Councillor LeBroy is nodding, and that's the way I suggest we go. So Lynn, if we could get the recommendations up, and yes, it's going to take a little bit of time, but it saves coming back to it retrospectively, and we've had that once already in.
I think we need to be clear, Jim. We're voting on the amendments.
Yeah.
Yeah, individually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
what I'm saying is I don't want to lose the substantive bit of the proposal.
We won't.
So we have to come back and vote again on the whole block.
Yep.
Okay.
So let's deal with the amendments and then let's come back. So Lynn, if you could get those up, we can take those hopefully in the next few minutes.
Hang on, sorry, I'm just getting there.
Thank you.
Chair, I'm hoping that we're going to take Dick's on block.
That's what I was hoping.
Well, procedurally,
Cornelius, thank you.
We have to go on individually.
I'll leave the Dem Services Officer to make the arrangements. If Councillor Pollard, in his capacity as Chair of Constitution and Governance, disagrees, then I'm sure he will say. Jane, thank you.
Jim, it's Dick. Can I just ask something?
I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to, if we don't move this now, I'm going to suspend the meeting for 10 minutes while we actually get this sorted.
I'll second that.
Right, okay. We suspend the meeting for 10 minutes so that we can have, if people return in 10 minutes, I'm happy to stay online, as I'm hoping Councillor Pollard will be, and Councillor LeBroy, and we can agree the best way of tackling this. Thank you. Meeting suspended.
What I would suggest, Jim, and you're very kindly quoting me as the chairman of CG. I am the chair. I'm not the font of all knowledge, but
you are more the font of all knowledge than I am, John, and this is becoming frankly.
I would suggest that we take Dick's amendments en bloc. And then Cornelius's amendment en bloc, and then if the substantive motion, that's all of the recommendations, have been amended or not, we take that en bloc. So 3 votes rather than a number.
Fine.
Members, can I just intervene to remind that the live stream's still running even though the meeting is adjourned, so just so that you're aware that the public can hear your discussion.
Thank you, Leanne. I always welcome that morning.
Could I come in at this point, Chair?
If it's
no, I don't think it's anything to do with you, Cornelius. Very
hang on. All right, Chair. Look, I don't think I appreciate the need to speed up the meeting. You know, I'm not adverse to that at all. But I think there's an element of favouritism in that the amendments I don't have a problem with, we can vote on block, and the one that I don't like the look of, we've got to vote on separately. I think you take them on block or you take them separately.
And I think the reason for that, Cornelius, is that no one has suggested they would vote against Dick's amendments. There's been no comment that I've heard against Dick's proposals, whereas there has been some counter argument against your proposal.
Agree. Yeah. Councillor Olivier, the idea that favouritism exists when you've had about 17 contributions thus far is frankly ridiculous. So I suggest through the chair that we go with what has been proposed.
Yeah, can I say, Jay, I think you're taking...
Could I get a word in edgeways, please?
Yeah, I was sorry, I didn't... Favouritism was an inappropriate use of the word, shall we say. I didn't mean it like that, but go on, Dick, sorry.
I was just going to say, Jim, what I was attempting to do was to make some slight tweaks that I thought Peter was going to take on board and incorporate, so there wouldn't be need for the amendments, because I've not actually moved anything technically yet, and I don't have a seconder, and we've not actually done that because I was just hoping Peter was going to say, yeah, that makes sense, incorporate it and just keep it going gently through. That was what I was trying to do, so sorry if it didn't quite work out like that, but
Perhaps because surely it's Peter and his seconder to say whether or not they're happy to take on board the amendments.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So Jim, if this makes it quicker or simpler, I'm happy to accept Dick's amendments. And sorry, apologies, Cornelius, but I'm not happy to accept yours.
You don't have to apologise. You don't have to apologise. I think this, it would have been a good idea for you to just accept the amendments. Yeah, it's your fault, basically.
Okay. So that's useful. So that's clear then, Jim.
Yeah, okay. Fine.
So we vote on Cornelius's amendment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we vote on the substantive motion because Peter's accepted all the other amendments.
Yeah.
Peter, to be helpful to you on one more thing, it's difficult doing it this way. On the recommendation, the adding the text to make a recommendation in terms of the rural urban study, I did say I'd be happy to put in the words for the wider expenditure where possible, but I noticed Lynn hasn't done that. So if you want to put that in to give yourself more wriggle room, I think that would be very sensible. I don't know if Lynn heard that. So
I don't suggest we change anything now. I don't suggest we change anything, Dick. We've seen them. They've been written up. And I think we will then have another debate, frankly.
I was concerned with that. So,
sorry, Chairman, I've slightly got a different opinion to everybody else, in that this is the proposal on the table, which was proposed by Councillor Olivier and seconded by Councillor Duffin. Although Councillor LeBroy said that he was going to propose the recommendations, they were not seconded. And they're not put forward. So this is the recommendation which Councillor Olivier has put forward. He's agreed to take on Councillor Cole's amendments, and he's added in the amendment with regard to the tourism levy. So in my opinion, this is what we do need to vote on. It's been seconded by Councillor Duffin. If Councillor Duffin wants to change that's different. But then we vote on it en bloc.
But then it could be lost.
Yes, probably.
So then if it gets lost, does then Councillor LeBroy have to propose what we have plus Dick Coles, but not adding in Cornelius, and then we can vote on that?
Yes, we can. That's correct.
That's all right, then.
It's a bit round the wrong way.
It's round the wrong way.
Lynn, can I just say
round the wrong way? It is the correct way.
Is this, given that I've suspended the meeting, is this still being broadcast?
It is still being broadcast, yes.
Well, how come, well, that frankly is ridiculous, bearing in mind what we're discussing. So when I said suspend the meeting, I intended that the broadcast be stopped. Do we have the ability to do that?
I can check with the live stream operator, Chairman.
Well, yes, thank you. If we have the ability, that will be sensible. Then we can resolve this, and then we can take the vote in what might be regarded as an organised, civilised, and correct way, without interruption from any of the members.
So I think maybe where we went wrong,
Including Councillor Duffin.
I'm just waiting for confirmation, Chairman.
Thank you.
I know that Councillor Frost wants to know what he's missed.
Thank you, Councillor Olivier.
Yeah, right.
Chairman, I've heard from the live stream operator. So the message is that you can have the debate and then break for lunch, and then part 2 of the webcast will have to start at 1:30. The new live stream link.
Okay, so that should allow us to have a break and hopefully get at least the presentation element of the next report in as well. So can we be clear, therefore, at this stage exactly what order we're voting on things? And then I will call the meeting to order, and we can have those, but we can take those votes.
Chairman, it's my opinion that Councillor Olivier has proposed the recommendations, taking on board Councillor Cole's amendments. He's made his own amendment himself to the officer recommendations, or to the panel's recommendations, should I say. Those were the ones that Councillor Olivier proposed. They were seconded by Councillor Duffin, and it's those that is the only recommendation on the table, and we need to vote on it en bloc. If it falls, then there can be another proposal put forward, which again we can vote on.
Chairman, sorry, did you want the live stream ceased?
I think we're approaching the time, Lynn, where we have to actually go ahead now and take the vote. So,
can I just say, Jim, I think we need to be clear that the two things. First of all, that whatever's been proposed and seconded can be withdrawn. So that could give us, in my opinion, and I'm not disagreeing with Lynn, but if we vote on if we take a vote on the recommendations, then that is a vote on the recommendations. We need to take a vote on the amendments to the recommendations. Otherwise, the whole kit and caboodle is lost, in my opinion.
Okay.
Councillor Pollard, if they are lost, then somebody can propose the recommendations again with Councillor Cole's suggested amendments, or amend, can propose the recommendations, and we vote on those.
Okay, I accept that, but reluctantly, because I thought we had a 6-month rule, and nothing can be voted on again for 6 months.
But Councillor Pollard, the recommendation would have fallen, so it would be a clean slate again.
Cornelius, why don't you just withdraw yours and then resubmit it just on the amendment, and then it's easy.
That's correct, actually. Councillor Jenkin and Councillor Broy could give a notification of a further amendment, and we would have to take that one first.
Yeah, you'll have to hold my hand through this one, Lynn, because this is.
It is absolutely correct. I don't know why I didn't think about it. I do apologise.
Okay, so Lynn, if we resume the meeting, you will take us through the process. Yes, Councillor De Broglie, are you happy to propose a further amendment?
This will be the first amendment. So this is an amendment that Councillor Le Broglie is about to make.
Well, sorry, Jim, but I'm a little lost. Am I proposing that the amendment is Dick's amendments plus the original, with the exclusion?
You know, I suspect in years to come this is going to be an example which appears all over the place, and frankly it's embarrassing. So can I confirm that the live stream is paused at this stage?
It is not, Chairman.
It isn't.
Shall we pause it now?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll let the live stream operator confirm.
screen? Do you want these on the screen?
Yes, I think that would be helpful if that's available. Thank you.
I've just asked for the stream to be restarted. I'll let you know when that's happened.
Thank you.
We're live again. Thank you, Chairman.
Leanne, thank you. Welcome back, everybody. Councillor Olivier.
Yes, Chair, I'm happy to withdraw my amendment in the form that I proposed it. That is to say, covering all the proposals put forward by Councillor Cole and my own proposal a feasibility study into a tourism levy. So I withdraw that amendment, and I believe my seconder agrees with that withdrawal.
Councillor
Yes,
Duffy?
I'm happy to second that.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful in terms of moving things along. Councillor LeBroy.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so it's my delight at this point to propose the original paper incorporating the modifications made by Councillor Cole to the committee.
Thank you. Do you have a seconder for that? I will second if need be.
I'm happy to second.
Okay, is that Councillor Frost? Oh, sorry, Councillor Towell has seconded that. I'll take Councillor Towell.
Oh yeah, I'm not precious, so that's fine.
Thank you. Councillor Towell, thank you. Okay, so. Yes, Councillor Olivier?
I wish to propose an amendment, which I think we can see the wording on screen, can we, Chair?
We will be able to shortly, Councillor Olivier.
Yeah. It's in yellow.
And we got, sorry, it's gone down a bit. If you don't mind moving up slightly, I've lost sight of it. Right, okay. And the possibility of introducing a tourism levy on, and could you move it up slightly more, Lynn? Thank you. Slightly more. For reinvestment, rather than reinvesting in the tourism, for reinvestment in the tourism industry. So, and the possibility of introducing a tourism levy on businesses for reinvestment in the tourism industry.
Councillor Olivier, thank you. Councillor Duffin, are you willing to second that?
I'm happy to second that. I think doing both bits of work at the same time makes sense.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So, Lynn.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm just going to share my screen there a moment. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. We need to vote on the amendment first, which is around the tourism levy. And if that is carried, then that will be the amendment that is incorporated in Councillor LeBroy's proposal. So this is just on that one element around the tourism levy, which was, I don't know if somebody's got that in front of them. So it is recommendation 1L. So we're just voting on that bit and the amendment. So if I go to the vote, Councillor Biscoe has left the meeting. So the next one is Councillor Brown.
4.
Councillor Cole.
Abstain.
Councillor Duffin.
4.
Councillor Ellenbrook.
Against.
Councillor Frost.
Against.
Councillor LeBroy.
Against.
Councillor McKenna.
Against.
Councillor Towell.
Against.
Councillor Olivier.
For.
Councillor Pascoe.
Against.
Councillor Pollard.
Against.
Councillor Robinson.
Against.
Councillor Rushworth.
Against.
Councillor Thomas.
Against.
Thank you, Chairman. That amendment has been lost. 3 votes for, 10 against and 1 abstention.
Lynn, thank you.
Thank you. And then we go back to the original proposal, which was put forward by Councillor LeBroy and seconded by Councillor Towell. And that was the recommendations that are set out in the report on page 59, with the suggested amendments put forward by Councillor Cole, which has been on the screen with the amendments outlined in red. So that's what we're voting on now, and it is proposed by Councillor LeBroy and seconded by Councillor Towell. So Councillor Brown, please. Councillor Brown?
4.
Thank you. Councillor Cole?
4.
Councillor Duffin? 4. Councillor Ellenbrook?
4.
Councillor Frost?
4.
Councillor LeBroy?
4.
Councillor McKenna?
4.
Councillor Towell?
4.
Councillor Olivier?
4.
Councillor Pascoe?
4.
Councillor Pollard?
4.
Councillor Robinson?
4.
Councillor Rushworth?
4.
Councillor Thomas?
4.
Thank you, Chairman. Apart from Councillor Biscoe is not with us at the moment, that's been carried unanimously.
Okay, thank you. So can you just confirm how long we have left on this particular live stream before we need to dial in again? Is it 1:30?
It's until 2 o'clock, actually.
It's until 2 o'clock then, okay. Most members have had a break. I haven't, as I know 3 or 4 others haven't. So it's now 12:37. If you could come back at 12:40, so 3 minutes, we will move on with item 8, which is the 5-year land supply and housing delivery.
Members, could you please turn off your microphones and any cameras you're using for the duration of the break? Thank you.
Okay, welcome back everybody. Thank you for your forbearance, and particular thanks for your patience with the previous item. We got there eventually, but it was an interesting constitutional test, but I'm happy that what we've determined will stand up to scrutiny. So thank you everybody. So this takes us on to agenda item number 8, and this is the 5-year land supply and housing delivery. Richard Grant, I believe, is presenting what will be a presentation of 15 minutes or so, at which point we'll have time for questions and comments from members. I am keen that we take this to the vote before 2 o'clock, which would allow us perhaps 20 minutes for a lunch break, and we can then reconvene on the new link. So, Richard, are you good to go?
I am, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Take it away.
I shall share my screen and hopefully this will work.
Yeah, can see that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. So thank you, Chair. This item looks at an update for Committee on Housing Delivery and Supply, specifically looking at the 5-year land supply housing delivery test and some of the implications and next steps for that. I'll run through this presentation as quickly as I can so we can move on to questions. And members will, I'm sure, be relieved to know we're now into the very complicated stuff, and that is why I'm going to use a presentation to try and get across the key messages for this report. So what I want to run through very quickly are to set out the results of the 5-year land supply and the housing delivery test for Cornwall, and then the future supply of housing land that we've identified via the local plan and the site allocations DPD, to explain the implications of those results, particularly around the local plan and next steps in terms of where we think we need to go next with that, and then to look ahead around the next steps for delivery, policy developments, local plan review, and a bit of a future gazing exercise as to what we need to be considering over the next 12 months. So just very quickly to run through some of these definitions and terms. 5-year land supply is a test which is given to us by government in the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF. It essentially looks at planning commitments versus our local plan target over the next 5 years. And that's the important point, is it's looking at sort of very immediate supply of land that is deliverable for housing. The housing delivery test was introduced by the government in 2018 and is something which is administered and produced by the government. It is not something that we ourselves assess, but we see those results being put out on the government website, usually around about January time each year, as indeed happened this year. Our housing trajectory is a term that is then used to say this is our forward plan of sites that we are expecting to come forward to meet the local plan targets. The local plan objectively assessed need is essentially the target in the local plan, and members will recall the local plan runs from 2010 to 2030 as its time frame, what's known as the plan period, and that figure is 2,625 dwellings per annum that we are expecting to deliver. And then finally, the local housing need, which is calculated again by a methodology given to us by the government. Now, members may recall last year, the end of last year, there was a proposal from government to significantly change that methodology, which would have given Cornwall a very high new housing need number. That proposal was withdrawn by government, and so therefore we are where we were before, where our standard methodology number would be 2,820 dwellings per annum. Those figures and those definitions will come back in the next few slides, so bear those in mind. There we go. So moving swiftly onto the 5-year land supply then. Councils must demonstrate 5 years worth of deliverable housing supply in order to show that they are delivering against their local plan allocations and they are meeting needs. Supply is the permissions that we can identify that will deliver within those 5 years. So they must be essentially homes that we have got a very strong understanding will be built in that 5-year time period. So they can include planning permissions, they can include site allocations, but we must have evidence and strong evidence that the homes will be built in that time period. For Cornwall, our requirement is the local plan requirement of 2,625 homes each year, multiplied by 5 for the 5 years, and that gives us 13,125 homes as our requirement. But the government then requires us to add a buffer on of 5% to ensure that we are able to meet our requirement, that we are ensuring choice and competition in the market, and that translates through to 656 new homes. So therefore, the requirement for our 5-year land supply is 13,781 new homes over those 5 years to be built. So this chart gives an indication then of where we actually are in terms of our supply and how it is made up. Members may not be able to read that quite closely enough, but what it shows is that our deliverable supply is at 17,900 new homes, therefore in excess of the number we need to be able to demonstrate a 5-year land supply. And most of those homes, you'll see from the graph on the left-hand side, are with permissions, which gives us some certainty around deliverability. And then this table gives you the figures that underpin that graph. Running through to the end there, you'll see what it gives us is 6.5 years of supply. And this is where we want to be, because this means that we've demonstrated that we have over 5 years supply. We are in a strong position in terms of being able to defend that 5-year land supply position. And of course, we would be in a position which we had much less than that, where we could be vulnerable to appeals, where developers would be trying to persuade an inspector that some of the sites we're counting shouldn't be in there, and we might drop below 5 years. And the implications of that are significant. If we can't demonstrate a 5-year land supply, we essentially see the weight that we can give to our policies in the local plan significantly reduced. The presumption in favour of sustainable development is applied, and suddenly we are effectively out of control of the housing proposals coming forwards in Cornwall. So the key point here is that having our 5-year supply so strong gives us that robust position that we can use to guarantee the weight of our policies that we can apply with all the force that we can muster from the local plan. The housing delivery test. This is a 3-year test, and if you think that the 5-year land supply is looking ahead and looking forwards to see what we have got in our pipeline to meet needs, the housing delivery test looks backwards to see what we've actually done and to see if we have actually delivered against those requirements. The supply side in this case comes from our completion figures, so the monitoring of how many homes are built each year. That gives us over 3 years the supply, the number of homes that we've delivered against need. Our requirement is slightly more complex. I won't go into the details of it because frankly it is one of those things that our statistics friends do understand, but some of us don't so quite so closely. But it essentially would use either the local housing need assessment, which we discussed earlier, which is the government's methodology, or we use our local plan requirements, whichever is the lowest. And so in the world that we're in at the moment, where our local plan requirement is 2625 a year, that is what we are assessed against in terms of the housing delivery test. Now, if we don't meet the test, there are some significant consequences that I've detailed at the bottom of the slide. If we are slightly under, just 95% of our target, so just 5% under where we should be, we must produce an action plan to show what we will do to address that under delivery. At 85%, i.e. just 15% under our target, we would find a 20% buffer added to our 5-year land supply. You'll recall we're at a 5% buffer at the moment, so a 20% buffer would be the equivalent of an extra year's worth of supply that we need to identify in that 5-year supply period. And finally, if we are at 75%, so 25% under our requirement, we find that presumption in favour of sustainable development is applied automatically, and that would be regardless of our 5-year land supply position. So again, it would be a significant and very detrimental position to get to, because we'd effectively again be losing control over our local plan policies, and our local plan policies would not be worth the weight that we can give them at the moment. So in terms of our position today, these are the figures government have issued in January this year, so January 2021 these came out. And they do show that we're in a very healthy position, that we have got actually around about 133% of our housing delivery test. So that means we've actually over-delivered against those requirement figures. But what I wanted to just flag up was that actually, in terms of our longer term trend rates, those high delivery figures are because of our last 3 or 4 years of delivery. If we go back to the start of the plan period, you'll see we started out at quite a low level of delivery. So actually, we have now achieved an average completions a year of 2664, which is round about where we need to be to continue on track to deliver the local plan. So it is a strong position to be in, that we can show in terms of housing delivery test. We are nowhere near seeing those consequences and implications being enforced upon us by the government, and we need to carry on ensuring that we continue delivering at that broad level to bring forward our local plan targets and deliver on track. And then turning towards looking ahead then to see that we can actually carry on and deliver against the local plan targets. This is a graph that shows you the housing trajectory, the supply that we have going forwards over the entire plan period. So you'll see this graph starts at 2010, goes all the way through to 2029, i.e. the last year before our local plan would effectively end. We're halfway through the period, and what we're showing is that we are on track to deliver. We have got a supply of land that we are confident we can deliver to get us to that local plan figure of just over 52,000 homes. In the trajectory, you'll notice we have actually identified more than that, but that's not a bad thing, because that means that we are in a position where we can demonstrate some flexibility of supply. And in a nutshell, that means that if we saw some of the sites that are in this trajectory not coming forwards and delivery not happening on those sites, we have a buffer that enables us to actually show we can continue to deliver against the local plan. What I want to just flag up in this next graph here is the makeup of that supply. It is made up of our understanding of the whole list of sites that we're aware of in Cornwall that will come forward in that next 10-year period. The important point I think from this to note is that actually we know where by far the vast majority of those sites actually are. There is only one category in that ring donut there, which is windfalls, which are sites that we have not identified in a plan, or have not yet been built, or have not already got permission. So our trajectory is solid in that sense, that we're not relying upon estimates and crystal ball gazing to find out where these sites should be. We know where they're going to come forward from over that 10-year period, and we can have some certainty therefore that our local plan will be delivered. Now I wanted to flag up just quickly a few last considerations before we turn to questions. The first one is an update from members quickly on the government's proposals for reform of the planning system, which you'll recall were introduced in the planning white paper, Planning for the Future, that was published in autumn last year. The government had proposed a few things here, fundamental change of the planning system and the local plans, the whole way in which the local accountability element of planning works. In terms of the presentation today, it's worth noting that the government proposed to scrap the 5-year land supply as part of its planning reforms on the basis that they expect the new system to provide a much greater certainty around sites coming forwards on a track to meet need. But they would retain the housing delivery test. So we would still be examined by the government on an annual basis to see that delivery is happening as expected. I've mentioned that they were also looking to revise the standard methodology for calculating housing need, and that would have led to very significant changes to Cornwall's standard methodology figure up to around about 4,000 homes a year. But at the end of December, government retracted those proposals, and there's no sign at the present time that anything further will be done to change the standard methodology. So we can have some certainty around that figure. There was also some other considerations here, just to sort of quickly put out to members. Our local plan is something that we need to start thinking about this year. The regulations on the local plan mean that we have to start looking at when it would be right to replace it. And it's worth noting that when we have to do that, it's likely we have to start looking at our standard methodology figure as our new housing needs. So that does mean that we'd have to start looking at what the implications of that would be. That methodology figure is volatile. It can change quite significantly because of household growth rates, because of affordability, and also because of the household projections that government puts out nationally. So we are balancing all these things up together. But in terms of what we have to do with the local plan and when these things might need to be really considered, we're looking very, very closely at whether or not our plan is up to date. And it's worth members having a quick update and reminder of what some of these requirements are. The regulations that are named there, the ones that we have to comply with in terms of how we do a local plan. What those regulations say is that a plan must be reviewed by the time it reaches its 5th birthday, 5 years after it's been adopted. The Cornwall local plan reaches that point in November this year. but it's important to realise what a review is and what an update is. What the regulations say is that we must review our plan, and that essentially is an audit of whether or not we consider our policies to be up to date still. If we think they are up to date, we don't need to do anything else, and we can continue using our plan as it's written for the next 5 years. Now, we need to therefore decide by December whether or not our plan is up to date and whether or not we think we need to go through a whole new local plan process to update it, or whether we can actually hold the line and stick with where we are. And clearly a key thing that the government would be looking at in terms to make that judgment, and which is set out in a number of guidance documents, is our local plan housing requirements and whether or not we're in line with the methodology. Now, this is an early look at where we think we are in terms of the numbers on this, because although our housing requirement in the plan is lower than the standard methodology, our supply and our delivery is higher. And we're therefore looking very closely to see whether this means that in actual fact we can demonstrate that even though the plan itself, the number may not be quite where the government will wish it to be, it's not far off, and our delivery will put us in a place where we would be in line with the methodology. And if that's what we can prove, then there would be a strong argument to say we don't need to update our local plan and we can continue using it as it is for the next 5 years. And that would give us some continuity and give us some stability in terms of planning for the future. And clearly that is something we want to look very closely at. I think what it does show is that the strength of our supply and the strength of our delivery, which has come through from the site allocations DPD and from the work that's been done throughout the council to ensure that we can maintain that drive, has put us in a very strong position in terms of being able to give our local plan further weight and to carry on using it for the next 5 years. There's a quick point here about the buffer. I mean, it is useful to have that buffer in place, both in 5-year land supply terms and in terms of the housing trajectory, and therefore in terms of how we can look at the local plan review conundrum. We've actually got a buffer in terms of our future supply of around about 14% of the local plan requirement. Most inspectors in the last few years have required local plans in their examination phases to have a buffer of around about 15% in any case. This wasn't something that the inspector did for the Cornwall local plan at that time. It is something that has happened more frequently since then. So actually, again, we can tick a box and say that our buffer is broadly where we think it should be to guarantee that supply and that flexibility. And very finally, I wanted to just flag up, looking ahead, what we think we'll be looking at when the numbers come out for the past 12 months of delivery. Clearly, we're looking at a very exceptional 12-month period with the effect of the pandemic and of the lockdowns. And it would seem very likely that we will see the delivery at a lower level than we have seen the last few years, given that the construction industry ceased to work for a period of time during 2020. The extent of that isn't yet clear, and we won't get the results of the monitoring of the last 12 months until after the 1st of April. That's the monitoring year that we use. But one thing we can say is that the strong 5-year land supply and housing delivery test positions outlined here mean that I don't think we'll face any kind of consequences if we do see a drop off. Our performance is strong enough to absorb the impacts, and as long as we can then pick up pace again, I don't think it will change the conclusions that we are setting out for you in this report today. So in summary, and looking at the next steps, what we're showing, I think, is our 5-year land supply and our housing delivery test both show very strong results, and our trajectory of sites gives us a very good position to meet our local plan targets by 2030. This means that as of today and going ahead and forwards, we can apply our local plan policies with full weight and full confidence, and that's a strong position to be in. It means that we can continue to apply them and require developments to deliver on the agenda that we put in the local plan. And our local plan review, it looks as if it may be able to conclude that the Cornwall local plan can remain in an up-to-date state for the next 5 years, therefore avoiding the need to go through a new local plan process immediately. And of course, that will be something we'll keep a very close eye on with the new results coming out and with any further announcements regarding planning reform from the government. So we felt it wise, therefore, to suggest to members that we bring a report to the committee in the summer of this year, that will set out the results of the monitoring exercise for the 2020-21 monitoring year, any further updates and insights we've gleaned from the government regarding planning reform and what may happen to the system over the next couple of years, and then finally the information and the conclusions that we will come to regarding local plan review and what our recommendations may well be. Thank you, members, and I can now take any questions.
Richard, thank you very much. For members' benefit, the presentation just given will be made available after the meeting, so you'll have copies of it. So I've got Councillor Frost and then Councillor Brown to start us with.
Thank you, Chair. My question is rather parochial, but I'll try and do it in a generic way. So I guess, as everyone's aware, I have a allocation in my division that is very controversial and has now actually received objections from the Environment Agency. So I guess the generic question is that as our land supply is looking very good, are we able now to look at potential sites we put in but may not be suitable that we could potentially take out, as that it's not going to risk our land supply anymore? I guess is the question I'm going to ask, especially in light that if a development has lots of objections from other bodies.
Lee, thank you. Malcolm, can I ask you to ask any question you may have, and then we can get a response to that.
Yes, Chairman. With your indulgence, I would like to make a few points. Firstly, I would like the officer to confirm whether the 5-year supply is for Cornwall as a whole, or whether it is for smaller areas like community network panels. So that, for example, if there was a planning appeal in Penzance, that the issue would be about land supply for the whole of Cornwall. Secondly, as everyone will recall, Councillor Cole and I put a motion through council with strong opposition to the way that the government is seeking to change. I'm not going to use the word reform. My definition of reform is something which makes a situation better, whereas what they want to do overall will make the situation worse. And I think our opposition, I see Councillor Cole is following me. I think our opposition is probably as strong as ever. All the government have done so far is to withdraw one particularly bad aspect, but there are lots of other bad aspects as well. Next point I want to make is the whole timing of the work on the new plan is unfortunate because of the census. As we all know, the census is now imminent, and it's very important the census is as accurate as possible. But what it means is there are going to be a whole load of new population projections and then household projections coming out of Office for National Statistics at the point that we and other local authorities will be well advanced on our work about updating the local plan. Now, I'm not going to comment on points for the next council because that's relevant for people who are elected, but I do just want to make the point that there's already been quite a bit of comment on this report on social media, and the idea that we're
Thank you.
Can you let me go on a little bit more?
Another minute, Councillor Brown.
Because I haven't spoken today yet. The fact that the officer says that our provision is 133% of what is expected. He calls that very healthy. I call it very unhealthy because I don't think the bulk of the public are going to welcome that. They're going to be very concerned that we are condoning so much of Cornwall being built over for houses which will not be affordable to the local population. The last point I want to make very briefly, I hope you let me will finish the point I want to make, which is immediate, is that the good side of having a healthy 5-year supply, we have to have that. And those who are in the last council will know about appeals that we lost. But I do just wonder whether this is now an opportunity for officers and perhaps even this committee to have a look at whether we are tough enough on the criteria that we apply to applications. In other words, are we under duress from government condoning and approving some applications that we shouldn't? And that may be big applications like the one that Councillor Frost made. It may be sort of infill developments in gardens and things like that. But I think our planning policies are too tolerant to applicants, and I hope the fact that we've got more scope than we need is an opportunity not to throw that away, but just to review our policies and how our development control system, which is the word I still want to use, works. Thank you for your indulgence, Chairman.
Councillor Brown, no problem. As you say, you hadn't spoken earlier today, so no problem at all. Louise, did you want to come in now, or do you want to wait for the members?
No, sorry, I was happy for Richard to answer it, but I might follow up if I need to. If Richard needs.
Okay. Richard, could you sort of respond then to the first couple of sets of questions and comments you had from Councillors Frost and Councillor Malcolm Brown? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The first comment from Councillor Frost on sites and whether or not we can question whether they should be in the supply. I think the first point to make, I think, is obviously the planning application process and the site that Councillor Frost refers to is a way for us to do that, and clearly that will highlight any issues and problems with the site coming forwards that can be picked up in the detail. We need to have some caution around that though, because obviously our supply is made up of mostly identified sites, and when a site is coming up that is in that identification, if we were to remove it, we chip away in part of our supply. There is that buffer there which enables us to have some flexibility and confidence that we can still meet our overall levels if that happens, but we do need to be cautious. I wouldn't like to say, you know, that the results mean we can start having a wholesale look again, but it does mean that if there are details that are being picked up at application stage, we can scrutinise them properly, and we have got some leeway. Councillor Brown's comments, I mean, if I go through quickly one by one, some very good points here, I think. The first point in terms of the 5-year land supply, yes, the figures that I'm putting out there are for Cornwall as a whole. So essentially, this is the level at which the government will be scrutinising it. As our 5-year land supply is set out as a whole authority position, and the housing delivery test is given to us as a whole authority position. However, the way the local plan is set out, clearly we do talk about CNAs, we do talk about towns, and we need to have an eye on how that delivery is occurring across all of Cornwall and in line with what we say is our priorities in the site allocation DPD. So there is a lower level of detail that clearly we need to be alert to, and members will see when we start to release our monitoring work for this year that we can start to drill into that and see what those figures are like. But in terms of ticking the boxes for the national tests and the kind of things that nationally we are held accountable to, these figures are whole Cornwall and they are strong. In terms of the census, yes, a very, very good point. I mean, the census is obviously something we've probably all had the letters drop on our mats very recently. It does mean that we are at an interesting point in terms of demographic projections. But actually, the projections that go into these calculations are released roughly every couple of years. The subnational population projections that we refer to. The interesting point is that as you get further away from the census base point, the less accurate they probably are. And when the census then comes around again, it is a check and a bit of a validation over what those numbers look like. And in terms of timescales for the information that comes out from the ONS, it tends to then get drip fed out over a number of years following on from the census itself. So with the best will in the world, I would suspect we wouldn't start seeing anything that would be the kind of detailed information that would lead into our population projections and our housing projections for a couple of years yet. And if we are not undertaking a local plan update, so if our review comes out and says, actually, we can stick with what we've got and we are okay for another 5 years, of course, that might work quite well with that timescale, because it would mean that by the time that the information does come out from ONS, we'll be ready to start using it. In terms of the oversupply, yes, I understand the point entirely. It is one of those peculiarities. I think that's why I wanted to flag up that the actual rate over the 10-year delivery of the local plan so far is much more close to where we would expect it to be to meet the figure in the local plan. The last 3 or 4 years have been high. There's no guarantee that's going to continue. And so I think it's almost money in the bank that if we've got that figure now, we can be able to absorb lower delivery rates if they come forward this year, and potentially future years as well, without seeing those implications and consequences handed down to us by failing to meet our housing delivery test. I know that that's a bit of a technical planning argument, and I am shamelessly doing this as a planning officer, trying to tick the boxes for the government to give us the most weight to our policy. But I think it is one of those areas that is inevitably going to be tricky to explain. Are we tough enough on development? Well, it's a very, very good point, because I think the position that we are in means that we can apply our policies with full weight. And that means that we are able to say, well, we don't need to see off-plan development coming ahead. We can use our policies to really scrutinise and assess what that should look like and what it should be. I think it boils down then to how hard committees members wish to push those policies, and obviously we can have a look at that and we can take that back and discuss it in planning to see exactly what that looks like in terms of the development management world. And the final point I think Councillor Brown made about the planning reforms by government, I tend to have some sympathy with that view. I think there are an awful lot of things in the proposals that members will have seen. Our response went back at the end of last year and was very strong in terms of what we felt about some of those ideas. We need to have an eye on what does finally come out from government, because I think the one thing we can say is that change is going to happen and we are going to see a set of new measures coming out in the planning system. But we need to be very, very clear what that's going to be.
Richard, thank you. Councillor Cole next, please.
Thank you, Chair. It won't surprise Richard to know that I agreed with everything that Malcolm said in terms of where we are, the messaging that's coming out of this, because I've also had the odd comment come back to me in terms of how people are not happy that we're looking to create a housing trajectory that kind of outperforms, if you like, the local plan target quite significantly. And this document may be written to appease central government, but it's certainly doing enough to upset residents that are concerned about their communities. And Louise might even get phone calls from me in the next day or two. I'm trying to put together evidence for an appeal coming up, which is a delegated refusal of this authority, but I'm still worried that, are we fighting strongly enough to actually make sure that inappropriate developments do get refused? And I think that is something we do need to look at very, very closely. And we're just sort of falling into a government narrative, to be honest. And Chairman, could I make one request? When you take this to the vote, it says endorse the paper. Some of the narrative, if you like, I struggle with. I would much rather, under the first bit, if we could just say that we note what's been given, because it's basically statistics and stuff. So that means, but my question for Richard, he talked about the local plan review and whether we're going to update it and whether or not the policies are sound enough to be carried forward, and not having to do a review up front. He knows I've discussed areas of the local plan that are problematic. So where do we stand from the fact that at the moment we're publicising a DPD on climate change, which is all good, but that is a document that is in effect changing the policies in the local plan, and now we're saying as to whether or not the other policies can go forward, because if we can change one lot of policies, we can change other lots of policies and still keep going. So I think we need a bit more understanding of what we can do without leaving ourselves open, and what other flexibilities we have.
Councillor Cole, thank you. I'd like to bring in Councillor Olivier next, Richard, and then you can pick up the questions, assuming there are questions from Councillor Olivier at the same time. Thank you. Councillor Olivier.
Yeah, I think, following on from what Malcolm and others have said previously, it's really difficult for people to understand, not just councillors, but the general public, why we are doing well in terms of our 5-year land supply and housing delivery, but doing really, really badly in having enough places people in Cornwall can afford to live in. It's a conundrum which it's very difficult to explain to people why are we doing well in house building, but people can't find places to live. I would refer back to something we discussed this morning. Actually, the vice president of the, when we were talking about the economic strategy for coastal towns and communities, the people who came into evidence sessions and talked about losing a constant flow of homes in Cornwall to second homes and holiday lets, and then building new properties to replace them. So my question is, because I get asked this a lot, in our local plan target, how much was the target modified to account for the gradual erosion of properties in Cornwall as primary residences to holiday lets and second homes? Because I believe a precise figure was placed on it, but I don't want to.
Thank you.
I don't want to quote it without actually getting some confirmation, from one of our planning professionals.
Richard, unless you're sure, bearing in mind this may well end up on a leaflet, you might wish to have it checked and write separately to Councillor Olivier. Louise is nodding, but if you have the information to hand, then I'm sure we'd all be interested to hear it. So.
Yeah, I was just thinking, obviously, because in fairness to Richard, he hasn't been here that long, so it wasn't at that local plan inquiry. So I'm imagining he doesn't have that figure. Because I've got a figure in my head, which I think it is, but I would also prefer to check it. So, Councillor Livery, there was a definite figure that was into the inspector asked us at the time to uplift when we submitted our plan. He said, "I don't agree with your housing number. Go away, council, and do some work on it." And one of the things he specifically asked us to do was to include some figures for holiday homes and second homes and those kinds of issues. And there was a specific uplift put into that, so we can easily circulate that figure. But I think rather than guess at a figure, we'll probably circulate that after. Would that be fair, Richard?
Yeah,
yes.
I can always make up my own one if necessary. Okay.
Yeah, encouraging.
Just to check it before we give it to you.
Thanks. Okay.
Okay, Louise and Richard, it would be helpful to have that circulated to the membership of the committee, or indeed all members if you see fit, because it's probably something that whatever view you take would be of interest. So thank you. Richard, do you have a thought in terms of the question Councillor Cole posed to you?
Yes, which is an interesting question, because I suppose the starting point is that we are at the moment, as the committee knows, going through the climate emergency DPD process, which does put on a more up-to-date layer of policies covering a specific area. I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate process. The development plan doesn't have to be encapsulated in just one document, it can be in several. And the most recently adopted part of the development plan becomes the one that would be used in the event of a conflict. And of course, that depends if there is a conflict between policies in the first place. So in terms of what I've been sort of talking about today for the local plan review and the relevance of the figures on housing delivery, etc., that's one of the considerations. It's obviously a very important one in terms of the local plan, because housing numbers and homes to be built in the future will be a very contentious part of the plan, and it's something we at the moment have got a control over. So therefore, would we really want to open up that discussion again? But there may well be other parts of the plan when we come to do that review and audit, which we have to look at and ask whether or not they are doing what we want them to do, whether they're up to date. And that's part of the process we're going through at the moment that we'll need to bring back to council in the future, sometime later this year. So I suppose in that sense, what Councillor Cole is highlighting, the policy areas that he feels aren't working too well, are ones that we want to pick up in that process and look at what our solutions might be. And there could be a range of solutions. We don't have to say we must review and update the local plan to remedy that. There may be other things we can do. So certainly that is something that we are looking at, we are thinking through. And obviously I can have a chat with Councillor Cole offline to work out what some of those solutions might be.
Richard, thank you. And I presume in terms of if members do have follow-up beyond the meeting, you're happy to be contacted?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you for that answer. Councillor Rushworth.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to ask some devil's advocate questions, if I may, and they're not in any way in line with my thoughts of how things should go. But when the first plan was going through its data, its evidence base, migration into Cornwall was 3,000. A net migration to Cornwall was about 3,120. In 2019, which is a drop on the 2 previous years, migration was 5,526. That, if you equate that to new housing, migration is just about the open market housing we're building in Cornwall is just about keeping up with the supply. So, well, first question is, when we do this next review, will the new levels of migration be taken into account? But when we go back into the land supply, Cornwall Council, as is probably now the biggest land owner of approved sites or sites that are in the planning system in Cornwall. If any of those sites fail to come forward, and say Langarth, because we know there's a problem with the access at the moment, and so I'd like to know if that access problem has been resolved. We had the situation at Pyder where the planning permission was refused, and we don't know what's going to happen with the other landownings that we've got. Our housing delivery from Cornwall Council itself, not taking on the ones we buy or the grants that go to RSLs that have made up the 1,000 houses that we're promoting. What effect could that have on the on the 5-year land supply being challenged? And then my last question is, over the last period, over the 10-year period of the plan, the urban areas have outperformed massively the rural areas have outperformed massively the urban areas, and that's probably a lot to do with viability. If the government bring in, which I think they're trying to bring in, the three different forms of less protection, medium protection, and quite strong protection in the A and Bs and people like that, is that likely to slow down the delivery of housing, which are all Winfield sites, they're not allocation sites in the rural areas? So I just wanted to know what those 3 effects could have on our ability to achieve and maintain our 5-year land supply.
Okay, Stephen, thank you. Louise, you posted something in the chat box. Which do you want to say what it was? I think that's in relation to Stephen's first question.
No, it was in relation to Councillor Olivier's question.
Okay.
So that's the document that sets out that uplift, and the uplift was 7%, Councillor Olivier, but it sets it out in that document on page 15. So that was the answer. I had the right answer in my head, so I checked and I was pleased with myself. Just in terms of, I'll just pick up briefly with Stephen, and then I'll let Richard come in with anything. But I mean, I suppose in terms of, we can get back to you on specific things around Langarth focus issues. I'll ask Adam to pick up any specifics and update on the access issues. But I think in terms of what the council's contribution makes to our land supply, and this is the really important thing, is that we help smooth that curve, don't we? So we know that our supply always, and this is not just us, it's everywhere, it follows economic cycles. So we go through peaks and troughs, and that's why we as planners look at figures like, look to see healthy supplies, because we know that there'll probably be a trough that will come after a peak, and that's you can see that through the cycles that go past. And what the council can do with its own intervention, and why it's a really good thing and it's really supportive for the work that we do in delivering our plan, is that we can help with that counter-cyclical space. So we can invest in social housing, we can use our funds that come to us, we can use our capital to help those sites come forward in a way that private investors and house builders might start to retreat. So we know that in times of economic hardship in Cornwall, some of those major house builders retreat out from us and say that we're too peripheral and too risky, and they retreat upwards. So what the council does is important in helping us smooth our supply. So I think that's a really key part and a really key driver to why I think it's really important that the council does intervene, because it helps with that wider market piece, really. I think your question, Stephen, about whether we use migration figures ebbing and flowing, yes, again, they do as well, don't they? And some of that's actually tied to economic cycles. Definitely, you see that too. Yes, we can take that into account, and we would do in looking at our next local plan. But if the government does what it says it's going to do, it's going to give us a number, and that'll be a binary number effectively. So if they implement the next scale of the change, at some point we believe, what we've been told is we'll get a number, and it's a you have to do it. And so then in that respect, it's sort of irrelevant at that point, isn't it? They will have taken it into account in formulating the number that they give us, we assume, but we haven't got a process around that. So we'll just have to see how that goes. So I think those are the main points I was going to pick up. Richard, I don't know if there's any other bits that I didn't pick up.
Only a couple of other comments, really. I think you'd said most what I was going to say. And I think in terms of the migration point, I think the housing need calculation that was done for the local plan did look at an awful lot of these things in a great amount of detail. So it did go into huge amounts of demographic examination of what those factors were. The government's methodology that we would now be using if we were to update the plan today, they're in there, but they're not quite so firmly transparent as they were last time round, because what the government says we should be doing is using subnational population projections and then applying affordability to that. So it's in there, but it's not brought out quite so clearly. And as Louise has said, the suggestion for the new system is we simply get given a number by some process yet to be determined. So again, you would expect that those sort of considerations, along with all the other demographics as well, would be in there somewhere, but it may not be quite as open to interpretation as it is now. I think that the final point you asked about the new system and the three new zones that would come forward, it's an interesting question, because my view would be it may not have a huge amount of effect on these particular calculations, because the three zones, one's a growth zone, which is effectively giving outline consent to development via a plan. Well, that would probably be something we'd use as a tool very similar to an allocation today, so we'd still be in that position with a bunch of allocations that make up our need. The other two zones, what the middle zone would be one, I think, where it'd be a more flexible approach, which would probably open up more lines of supply, but in built-up areas, not in greenfield sites. And the final zone being a protection area might be something pretty similar to what we see today in terms of application regimes. The government's aspiration is pretty clearly that system is there to open up supply, not to constrain it. So I'd be surprised if it did constrain it. So I don't think it would have an effect. And part of the point that you note about rural areas outperforming urban areas at the moment, I think that's because the sites in urban areas are, as you highlight with Langgarth, large complex sites that take time to get off the ground. Those are the ones actually that start feeding into our supply position for the trajectory in the future.
Can I just come back with just one quick point?
It's quick, Stephen. Yeah.
Well, I think the big issue we have in Cornwall is being able to build in these urban areas, and that's strictly a lot down to viability, which I take on your comments. But how are we, getting over that viability thing, even though we have big sites, it's probably taking a long time because of viability, and that's an issue that worries me, because it's putting more pressure into the areas that Councillor Brown and Councillor Cole are saying are concerning all our residents, which I agree with.
Stephen, thank you. And Richard and Louise, thank you at this stage. Mike Thomas, Councillor Mike Thomas.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Richard. Really, this is a question for Louise. Back when we had the 50-50 research, which seems like sort of a long time ago, there was very much the feeling that the adding of more and more houses onto urban developments was not necessarily what's going to be happening in 50 years' time. And you were hinting very much at the idea of communities growing up around particular settlements, smaller settlements, which seems to be overtaken by the government's zoning, as I've just understood from what you're saying. What is your thinking on this? Do you think that we have got to the point where our towns cannot expand any further, or is there still a bit of space to add a few more housing estates?
Thank you.
That's a big question, Councillor Thomas. So I think that when we sort of stalled a little bit on some of our bigger spatial work in terms of the 50-50 work, because when the council and Jessie Hampshire's team started off on that Cornwall plan work, we felt that effectively that sets the vision, and the next phase from that is for us to take that next spatial picture from it. So we sort of had to let that, we felt we had to let that run its course before it was appropriate to pick up and look at that work again. So our sort of one of the things that we'll be talking to the new administration and Richard's looking at the moment is how we pick up and how we have those bigger spatial conversations in the early part of the next administration, which will help us plan forward for next local plans. So that's just a bit of process bit. In terms of, so I don't think that the government's proposals take away from the fact that we still have to have a thought about that, because it's still up to us where we allocate those growth zones. So we could allocate those growth zones as urban extensions to towns. We could allocate them as new communities. We could allocate them as very big sites. We could allocate them as hundreds of small sites. So that's still in our gift. And actually, the government isn't really mandating how we do that, which is kind of good in a way, because it gives us the ability to make that choice. And that's why we think it's really important as a council we do have a view of that, because that will help us decide what we do. So do I think that towns have capacity? I think that varies, doesn't it? And part of the answer to that is how much infrastructure you can put in. So I think there are probably towns and communities around where there will be capacity, because there will have been new infrastructure that's gone into place, and they'll be able to sustain that, and then an urban extension might be appropriate when we look at it. And I think there'll be places where we just think it's really hard to increase the size of that place and meet the cost of the infrastructure, and it might be better to do that in a new community on a different space. And that's the kind of challenging conversations we have to get back into, I think, in the beginning of the next administration. Yeah.
Sorry. And beyond that, probably as well.
Well, and beyond, yeah. I mean, it's not a scenario that's going to go away, because we keep having to go in the future, don't we? I think there is an interesting debate to be had about for us to think about, and it comes back a little bit to Stephen's comment about densification of towns. So, you know, do you want to supply some of your stuff within the confines of your existing towns? Can we push that further? Do we want to? Do we think these places should be more dense? What's our appetite for that? You know, is that a trade-off for greenfield development? And those are some of the conversations I think we'll also have to explore a bit more with you all. And the government's looking at us to use design coding as a way of trying to increase densification. So, yeah, lots of lots of interesting things for us to get into in the future.
Thank you.
Louise, thank you. Mike and Richard, thank you. Bird Biscoe, welcome back.
I'm sorry to have gone away, but here I am.
Sound like you're eating your lunch as well.
No, you're quite right. Yes, yes. Anyway, Louise, as you know, I take the view that this discussion needs to sit within the wider geographical picture of where we are and why we're here, and what's possible and what's not, as you understand. It seems to me that the major compelling force that is going to shape future land use policy is going to be climate change and the consequences of climate change. The most profound of which is that those places in the temperate zone of the planet are going to become more and more responsible for producing food to keep those people in the more arid zones of the planet, which are increasing, fed and watered. Otherwise, we'll see significant migrations and probably the potential for very big conflict, which are eminently avoidable. So in those terms, it seems to me that in Cornwall, where we are in the thick of that, we are getting to a point in terms of pursuing a policy about 5-year land supplies and, you know, consumption of land for speculative development, where the forces of food management on the one hand and feeding the lust for property on the other are actually going to rub up against each other and, you know, create some friction. And I'm just wondering what work we will be doing within the local plan process to measure where we are in that process, if you like, of the competition, that tension between land for food and land for housing, and there are various factors that bear on that, as we have discussed in the past. But it does seem to me that's the crucial one. And if we continue to simply apply a policy which is about the methodical consumption of land And for instance, if we look at, say, okay, we can constantly expand market towns, what we're doing is consuming our arable and pasture land at the expense of many other people as a result. And I'd just be interested to know how you're going to set about that.
Councillor Biscoe, thank you. If we could have a reasonably succinct response, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll give it's a big question. I'll give a brief response. Yeah, that's an issue, isn't it? And what's an issue in terms of food supply and food security as well is changes to agricultural processes and changes to climate leading to different crops and their different requirements, and all of that piece, isn't it, about impact on our supply. I mean, we still have huge amount of land in Cornwall which is undeveloped. So if you looked at our developable area, it's it's in the kind of 6-7%, depends on the figures that you quote and what you include in it. So there is scope there, Councillor Biscoe, but equally we need to understand in those choices that we're making that we're not using up valuable land for one use that really should be in the other use, which is your question, isn't it? So I agree, that's something we need to look at. So I think the answer is that in getting towards more work in future for local plan or 50/50, we need to scope out a piece of work which looks to address some of your questions and to review how we make those decisions, because I think in the past we've just kind of used your kind of typical grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 agricultural land, and my instinct is that life perhaps has moved on a little bit and we just need to have a think about whether that's some of those decisions are still appropriate and using some of those constraints are still appropriate. But it also comes back to my point I made earlier about whether we actually want to see more densification in terms of our towns, because that will save some of our land. So it comes into those wider discussions. So it's a good point, and we do need to do some work on that in future. So we'll pick it up.
I'd make one point, Chairman, if I may, and that is that a good field, well managed, is of course as complexly developed as a housing estate.
Agreed. And it's important that in that as well, that those because we know that some farmed or some agricultural land is not very biodiverse, and so there's a big challenge, isn't there, about that space as well. And we're doing a lot of work at the moment on nature recovery networks with our environment colleagues, which will help to steer some of those choices. So I think we'll be better informed, but I accept that the agricultural space is something we're not as informed on. And actually that came up, didn't it, as a recommendation, I think, on the inquiry before. One of the recommendations was for planning to make sure it was aware of changes to agricultural practices. So it perhaps ties neatly into that.
Louise, thank you. Bert, thank you, and Richard, thank you. We are now, I think, moving towards taking a vote on this. The recommendations are on page 72. The one thing which has come up, I'll read them out as they are. Firstly, that the information contained in this report regarding the results of the 5-year land supply position and the housing delivery test are endorsed by the committee. Councillor Cole suggested he might want to see that say noted. And then secondly, that officers are asked to provide a further briefing to committee at the appropriate time on the results of the monitoring of housing delivery. Moving over the page swiftly. Housing delivery in the 2021 financial year. So in other words, a retrospective. And I think, Richard, you suggested that could be done in summer of this year, which would be helpful, but we can leave it as is. Lee Frost has seconded Councillor Cole, so the recommendation 1 would be amended, or at least the proposal is, that the information contained in this report regarding the results of the 5-year land supply position and the housing delivery test are noted by the committee. The second one would remain as is. Lynn, are we good to go? We take the amendment first.
Yes, Chairman. So it's a proposal by Councillor Cole, seconded by Councillor Lee Frost. Recommendations as read out by you, with the change to noted as written in the report. So it's noted, not endorsed. So I'll go to the vote. So Councillor Biscoe.
4.
Thank you. Councillor Brown.
4.
Councillor Cole.
4.
Councillor Duffin.
4.
Councillor Ellenbrook.
4.
Councillor Frost.
4.
Councillor Broy.
4.
Councillor McKenna.
4.
Councillor Towell.
4.
Councillor Olivier.
4.
Councillor Pascoe.
4.
Councillor Pollard.
4.
Councillor Robinson.
4.
Councillor Rushworth.
I'd like to have seen us adopt it, but 4.
Thank you. And Councillor Thomas.
4.
Thank you very much, and that's unanimous, Chairman.
Lynn, thank you. Officers, thank you for the time and effort you've put in, and I'm sure the new council would welcome a report on this in summer, as suggested. I'm now going to propose that we take a 20-minute lunch break. Lynn, can I confirm that we now need to log off and then log on again on a separate link, but that link was included. It's just below the first one, isn't it? It's on the invitation.
No, Chairman, as members of the committee, we stay on this link. We just mute our microphones. But for members of the public that are watching and they wish to continue, then they go onto the second link at 2 o'clock.
Thank you. I'm glad I clarified that. So we stay on this link, members, preferably turning off our videos and our volume. And Lee, thank you very much, and have a good afternoon at work, I guess. But thank you very much for all your contributions you've made today. So we'll see you again on this line, members and officers, at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.